Welcome to the 10th volume of Horror Stories to Sleep With. Please enjoy your night with this video, but before, subscribe. Let's begin. The lake house was supposed to be an escape. Nestled deep in the woods, miles away from the nearest town, it stood as a solitary refuge overlooking a still, glassy lake. Mia had inherited it from her late uncle, a man she barely remembered but who had always been described as eccentric. She decided to spend a week there alone, a chance to decompress after a year of grinding work and personal upheaval. It was late afternoon when she arrived, the sun casting its golden glow across the water. The house was smaller than she had imagined, a two-story structure with peeling paint and a sagging porch. The air smelled of damp wood and moss, but there was a peculiar charm to the place. Inside, the house was sparse but functional. A fireplace dominated the living room, its mantel cluttered with odd trinkets. Small carved figures, a brass compass, and a framed photograph of a younger version of her uncle standing by the lake, his expression unreadable. Mia dropped her bags and walked through the house, taking stock. The windows were grimy but let in plenty of light, and the kitchen smelled faintly of mothballs. Upstairs, there were two bedrooms, one with an old iron bed frame and another filled with boxes and dusty furniture. The first night passed uneventfully, though the creaks and groans of the old house kept her awake longer than she would have liked. The forest outside was eerily quiet. No rustling leaves, no chirping crickets, just an oppressive silence. The second night, things began to feel off. It started with a noise, soft but deliberate. Mia was curled up on the couch, a book in hand, when she heard it. A faint tap, tap, tap against the living room window. She froze, her eyes darting toward the sound. The curtains were drawn, but the tapping continued, irregular and insistent. She tried to rationalize it. A branch, maybe, or a bird. Still, her heart raced as she approached the window. Slowly, she pulled the curtain aside. Nothing. The forest outside was bathed in moonlight, the lake shimmering faintly in the distance. No branches hung near the window, and no birds flitted nearby. Shaking her head, Mia closed the curtain and returned to the couch, trying to ignore the unease creeping up her spine. The tapping didn't return that night, but her sleep was restless, plagued by dreams of dark water and shifting shadows. By the third night, the unease had grown into something sharper. The house felt different, heavier. The air seemed colder, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. While making dinner, she noticed something odd on the kitchen table. A small, wet footprint. It was too small to belong to her, and the shape wasn't quite right. The toes were elongated, almost claw-like. Her first instinct was to blame herself. Maybe she'd spilled something earlier and hadn't noticed. But when she wiped it away, more appeared, trailing toward the stairs. She followed them hesitantly, each step echoing in the quiet house. The trail led to the second-floor hallway, where the air was noticeably colder. The footprints stopped at the door to the spare room, the one filled with her uncle's belongings. Mia hesitated, her hand hovering over the doorknob. A faint sound reached her ears, a low, guttural hum that seemed to come from the other side of the door. She opened it. The room was dark, the only light coming from a small, high window. The boxes and furniture were exactly as she'd left them, but the air felt alive. That hum, steady and almost mechanical, seemed to vibrate through the walls. She stepped inside, her flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. As she moved closer to the far corner of the room, something caught her eye. A box tipped over, its contents spilled across the floor. Among the scattered papers and trinkets was a notebook, its cover embossed with her uncle's initials. Mia picked it up, flipping through the pages. Most of it was incomprehensible, a jumble of symbols, cryptic notes, and what looked like sketches of the lake. But one page stood out. They watch from the water. They can't come inside unless you let them. Her breath caught as she reread the line. Beneath it was a crude drawing of the lake house, surrounded by figures, tall, thin, and featureless. A loud bang from downstairs made her jump, the notebook slipping from her hands. She ran to the hallway, her heart pounding. "Hello," she called, her voice shaking. There was no response. She descended the stairs slowly, clutching the flashlight like a weapon. The living room was empty, but the front door was ajar, swaying slightly in the breeze. Mia was certain she'd locked it. Her eyes scanned the room, landing on the window she'd checked the night before. It was wide open now, the curtains billowing softly. The tapping started again. But this time, it wasn't coming from the window. It was coming from inside the house. Mia froze, her heart hammering in her chest. The tapping was faint but deliberate, echoing through the silent house. She gripped her flashlight tighter, every instinct screaming at her to run. But run where? She was miles from the nearest town, alone in an unfamiliar house surrounded by endless forest. The tapping continued, rhythmic now, like a slow drumbeat. Came from deeper inside the house. The kitchen, the thought of someone or something already inside sent a chill racing down her spine. Taking a shaky breath, she moved toward the sound, her footsteps careful and silent. The flashlight beam bobbed across the walls as she entered the kitchen. Nothing seemed out of place at first glance. The table, the counters, the sink, all as she'd left them. Then she noticed the back door. It was open just a crack, the night air seeping in. The tapping stopped. Mia's breathing quickened as she approached the door, her pulse thundering in her ears. She reached out to close it, but before her fingers could touch the handle, she froze. Footsteps. They weren't hers. The sound was faint but unmistakable, soft, measured steps coming from the direction of the living room. Slowly, she turned her head, the flashlight shaking in her grip. "Who's there?" she called, her voice trembling. Silence. The steps stopped, and for a moment, the only sound was her own ragged breathing. Then, from the shadows beyond the doorway, a low creak, like someone shifting their weight on the old wooden floorboards. She backed away, bumping into the kitchen counter. The flashlight beam wavered, catching glimpses of the darkened living room. A chair, a corner of the rug, the edge of the couch. And then she saw it. A hand. It was pale and motionless, resting on the armrest of the couch, just visible in the dim light. It wasn't her imagination. Someone was sitting there, hidden in the shadows, watching her. Mia's chest tightened as she stared at the hand, her mind racing. She thought about running, about grabbing a knife from the counter, about screaming for help. But she was frozen in place, her body locked in a primal fight or flight paralysis. The hand moved, fingers curled slowly, deliberately, as if testing the air. "Get out," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The figure didn't respond. Instead, the hand disappeared, retreating into the darkness. And then the voice came, low and calm, from the living room. "You left the door open." Mia's heart nearly stopped. It wasn't a growl or a monstrous snarl. It was a man's voice, steady and eerily composed. "I didn't mean to scare you," he continued, as if they were having a casual conversation. "You shouldn't leave your doors unlocked out here. Dangerous people in the woods, you know." Her paralysis broke. She darted to the counter, grabbing the largest knife she could find. "Stay back," she shouted, her voice cracking. The man chuckled softly, his tone almost mocking. "You think that'll help?" Mia took a step back, the knife shaking in her hand. "I'll call the police," she said, knowing how hollow the threat sounded. There was no cell service this far out, and even if there were, help was hours away. The figure shifted in the shadows, and she heard the unmistakable sound of him standing up. The silhouette was tall, broad-shouldered, and unnervingly calm. "You've already let me in," he said, stepping closer. Mia screamed. Mia stumbled backward, clutching the knife so tightly her knuckles ached. The man's presence filled the room, every step deliberate, measured. His face was still obscured in shadow, but she could see the faint glint of his eyes, watching her like a predator sizing up its prey. "Stay back!" she shrieked again, waving the knife in front of her. Her voice echoed in the empty house, the sound swallowed by the surrounding silence. He didn't stop. Her mind raced. She thought of the front door. It was her only chance. If she could just get outside, she might outrun him, lose him in the woods. Without thinking, she bolted, darting around the kitchen table toward the hallway. Behind her, the man laughed, a low, guttural sound that sent a shiver down her spine. "Running won't help," he called after her, his voice calm, almost amused. Mia reached the front door, her hands fumbling with the lock. The knife clattered to the floor as she twisted the deadbolt. It clicked open just as she felt a hand grip her shoulder. "No!" she screamed, spinning around. She swung her arms wildly, clawing at him. Her nails scraped across fabric, then skin, but his grip didn't loosen. He yanked her back into the hallway, slamming the door shut with one fluid motion. The force sent her sprawling to the floor. The room spun as she scrambled backward, her palms slick with sweat. The man loomed over her, his face finally visible in the faint glow of the porch light. He was unremarkable, mid-30s, clean-shaven, with an unsettlingly calm expression. His lack of malice made him even more terrifying, like he was performing a routine chore. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," he said, crouching down to her level. Mia's breath came in short, panicked gasps. She searched for anything, any weapon, any escape route. Her eyes darted to the knife, now lying a few feet away. He noticed. "Go ahead," he said, tilting his head. "Try it." Mia lunged for the knife, her fingers closing around the handle. She swung it wildly, but he was faster. He grabbed her wrist, twisting it until the blade clattered to the floor again. "Feisty," he murmured, his grip like iron. "I like that." Desperation took over. She kicked at him, clawed at his face, did anything she could to break free. One of her kicks landed squarely on his shin, and he grunted in pain, his hold loosening just enough for her to wriggle free. She bolted down the hallway, her mind a blur of panic. The back door. It was her only chance now. Behind her, his footsteps followed, steady and relentless. "You can't hide forever," he called, his voice carrying a maddening calmness. Mia burst into the kitchen, yanking the door open. Cold night air hit her face as she stumbled onto the porch. She didn't stop to look back, sprinting into the woods. Branches tore at her skin, and roots threatened to trip her, but she didn't care. She had to keep moving. Somewhere behind her, she could hear him, not running, but walking, his footsteps crunching through the leaves. "You're only making it worse," he said, his voice uncomfortably close. Mia didn't stop. She didn't look back. She ran deeper into the woods, her chest burning, her legs trembling. She knew she couldn't keep this up forever, but she didn't have a choice. The forest swallowed her, the trees closing in, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out the moonlight. The darkness was suffocating, but it was her only cover. She tripped, falling hard onto the ground. Pain shot through her ankle as she tried to stand, but it gave out beneath her. She bit back a scream, dragging herself behind a fallen tree. The footsteps grew louder, Closer. Mia, he called, his voice almost sing-song. You can't hide from me. She pressed a hand over her mouth, stifling her breathing. Her entire body shook as she listened to him move through the trees, his pace unhurried, methodical. Mia, he repeated, his tone soft but chilling. Let's not make this ugly. She clutched her ankle, every nerve in her body screaming for her to move, to run. But she couldn't. And then the footsteps stopped. The silence was deafening. Mia strained to hear, her heart pounding in her ears. Where was he? Was he still searching? Or was he right? A hand clamped down on her shoulder. Mia's scream ripped through the forest, primal and raw. She twisted violently, flailing against the iron grip on her shoulder. The man loomed over her, his face illuminated by a sliver of moonlight breaking through the canopy. There was no malice in his expression, just a cold, detached calm that terrified her more than any rage could have. You've put up a good fight, he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. But it's over. Adrenaline surged through Mia's veins. She lashed out, her nails raking across his face. He grunted, recoiling just enough for her to seize the opportunity. With all the strength she could muster, she drove her knee upward, connecting with his ribs. The man stumbled back, giving her precious seconds to scramble away. Pain shot through her twisted ankle, but she forced herself to crawl, dragging her body over the damp forest floor. The rough bark of the fallen tree tore at her palms as she clawed her way behind it, using it as a temporary shield. Her mind raced. She needed a weapon, a way out. Anything. Her fingers brushed against something cold and metallic, a jagged piece of a broken branch. The man's footsteps resumed, slow and deliberate, crunching the dry leaves as he circled the tree. Come on, Mia, he said, his tone almost patronizing. You don't really think you can get away, do you? She gripped the branch tightly, her knuckles white. Her breathing was shallow, each inhale a fight against the fear threatening to consume her. She could hear him getting closer, the sound of his boots scraping against the undergrowth. You're just making this harder on yourself, he said, his voice so close now it sent a jolt of panic through her. Let's end this. No more games. The crunch of leaves stopped. Silence descended once again, thick and oppressive. Mia strained to hear, to pinpoint his location, but the forest betrayed her with its stillness. And then a whisper, right behind her. Found you. Mia spun, swinging the branch with all her might. It connected with his arm, a dull thud followed by his sharp intake of breath. She didn't stop. She swung again, this time aiming for his head. He ducked, the branch glancing off his shoulder, but it was enough to send him stumbling backward. Mia pushed herself to her feet, ignoring the searing pain in her ankle. She staggered forward, desperate to put distance between them. The forest stretched endlessly before her, a labyrinth of shadows and faint trails. Behind her, the man cursed under his breath, the first crack in his unsettling composure. You're making me angry, Mia, he called out, his voice colder now, edged with frustration. That's not a good idea. Her lungs burned, every breath a struggle as she limped through the woods. She could feel the blood from countless scratches trickling down her arms and legs, but she couldn't stop. Up ahead, a faint light pierced the darkness. A cabin? A car? She couldn't tell, but it was her only hope. She pushed forward, her determination outweighing her pain. The light grew brighter, closer. Her heart pounded in her chest as she stumbled into a small clearing. It wasn't a cabin. It was a fire, a crude campfire surrounded by a ring of stones. And beside it, scattered like a hunter's trophies, were items she recognized. A scarf she had lost weeks ago, the bracelet she'd sworn had vanished at work, and a small photograph of her pinned to a tree. Her blood ran cold. This wasn't random. "You've been mine for a long time." The man's voice came from the shadows, colder, closer. Mia turned, gripping the branch tighter, her back to the fire. The glow illuminated the woods around her, but the man remained just out of sight. "I've watched you, waited for the right moment," he continued, his voice dripping with unnerving calm. "And now, here we are." The firelight flickered, casting dancing shadows that played tricks on her eyes. She could feel him circling, a predator toying with its prey. This wasn't just a fight for survival anymore. This was personal. Mia's breath came in short, ragged gasps as she backed toward the fire. The heat licked at her skin, a small comfort against the icy dread pooling in her stomach. Her grip tightened around the branch, slick with her sweat and blood. Somewhere in the shadows, the man lingered, his silence more terrifying than his threats. Then, a twig snapped behind her. She spun instinctively, swinging the branch toward the sound. Connected with air. He was toying with her, forcing her to exhaust herself. "I have to finish this," she whispered to herself, her voice barely audible over the crackle of the fire. The man emerged from the shadows, his face eerily calm despite the fresh cuts on his cheek and arm. He moved deliberately, each step measured. In his hand, a knife glinted faintly in the firelight. "You've got fight in you," he said, his tone almost admiring. "I like that, but it's over, Mia. There's no one coming for you. No one to hear you scream." Her heart pounded, her mind racing. She had to think, had to act before he closed the gap. Her eyes darted to the fire. "Come and get me," she spat, her voice trembling but defiant. He smirked, taking another step closer. That was all she needed. With a burst of adrenaline, Mia plunged the branch into the fire, pulling out the burning end. Sparks flew as she swung the makeshift torch toward him. He recoiled, shielding his face, but she didn't stop. She swung wildly, forcing him back. The fire emboldened her, its light revealing the fear flickering in his eyes for the first time. But he wasn't retreating. Not fully. He lunged suddenly, grabbing her wrist and twisting hard. The torch fell from her hand, its flames sputtering against the dirt. They struggled, a violent tangle of limbs and desperation. The knife flashed between them, and Mia grabbed his arm, using every ounce of her strength to push it away. "You don't get to decide how this ends," she screamed, slamming her knee into his ribs. The impact loosened his grip just enough. She twisted free, grabbing the knife from his hand. Without thinking, she drove it into his shoulder, the blade sinking deep. He howled in pain, stumbling backward. Blood soaked his shirt, but he wasn't done. He reached for her again, his movements slower, more erratic. Mia didn't wait. She grabbed a heavy log from the fire's edge and swung it with all her strength. Connected with his head, sending him crashing to the ground. For a moment there was silence, just the crackling of the fire and her own ragged breaths. She stared at his motionless body, the log still clutched in her trembling hands. Slowly, she stepped back, her eyes darting to the dark woods around her. Was he truly alone? The question lingered, chilling her more than the night air. She turned and began limping away from the clearing, not daring to look back. This wasn't over. It wouldn't be over until she was safe, until she knew no one else was out there, waiting in the shadows. It was just past dusk when Martin's headlights first caught the silhouette. He had been driving for hours, winding his way through the back roads, trying to make it home before night completely swallowed the world. Route 47 was quiet, as it always was. The only sounds were the hum of his engine and the occasional crackle of the radio. The air outside was thick with the scent of wet earth from a recent rainstorm. The trees on either side of the road stood tall and silent, their outlines barely visible in the growing darkness. Martin had taken this route 100 times before, never expecting anything out of the ordinary. But tonight, something felt off. He couldn't place it, but the uneasy sensation gnawed at him. Maybe it was the rain, or the way the clouds hung low in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the landscape. Or maybe it was just the fatigue settling into his bones, pushing him closer to the edge of alertness. Either way, he couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. And then he saw it, a deer. It stood at the side of the road, motionless, its head turned towards him. Its coat was sleek and dark, blending in with the shadows of the trees. The animal didn't move as his car approached, but its gaze, its eyes, seemed to follow him. The more Martin looked, the more uncomfortable he felt. There was something unnatural about the way it stood there. It was too still, too perfect in the darkness. He tapped the brakes, instinctively slowing down, though there was plenty of space to pass. He didn't want to risk hitting it, of course, but there was something more to it than that. The deer's presence felt like a warning, an omen of something to come. As he neared, the deer's head shifted slightly. It moved as though considering something, as if it had been waiting for him to arrive. And then, without any warning, it stepped into the road. Martin slammed on the brakes, his tires screeching against the wet asphalt. His heart pounded in his chest as the deer froze in front of him, blocking the entire lane. It was just standing there, unmoving, like it was daring him to come closer. He could see the animal's eyes now, wide and reflecting the headlights, the pupils dilated unnaturally. It didn't look like any deer he'd ever seen before. His gaze wasn't just calm, it was almost calculating. Something about it felt wrong. "Come on, get out of the way," Martin muttered to himself, his voice low and nervous. He honked the horn, hoping to startle the creature into moving, but the deer didn't flinch. It just stood there, its body rigid and unwavering. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours. Martin wasn't sure what was worse, the silence of the moment or the way the deer stared at him, unblinking. He considered backing up, but the road behind him was narrow, and there was nowhere to turn around. The thought of turning his back on the creature didn't sit well with him, either. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the deer moved. Slowly, deliberately, it took a few steps backward, but it didn't leave the road. Instead, it turned its head to the side, its gaze now fixed on something deeper in the trees. Its tail flicked once, then twice, and with that, it stepped aside, just enough for Martin to drive past. He didn't hesitate. He pressed the accelerator, eager to put some distance between himself and the unnerving encounter. But as he passed the deer, something in the woods caught his eye. A shape, a shadow, hidden just beyond the trees. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. For a brief moment, Martin swore he saw something moving in the woods. Something tall, much taller than any man, but too large to be an animal. It was only for an instant, and by the time he looked again, it was gone. His grip tightened on the steering wheel. The rain was coming harder now, the windshield wipers working overtime to keep the glass clear. The road ahead felt longer somehow, the darkness pressing in on him. He needed to get home. Minutes passed. Then another curve in the road appeared, and Martin's heart skipped a beat. There, on the side of the road, was the deer once again. It was standing exactly where it had been before, staring at him with those same unsettling eyes. But this time it wasn't alone. Behind it, something moved, just out of the corner of his eye. Another shape, tall and shadowed. Martin's foot slammed on the brake again, the car screeching as it skidded to a stop. His breath caught in his throat as he tried to focus on what he was seeing. There, just past the deer, was a figure, tall, humanoid, but distorted in a way that didn't make sense. Its body was long, too long, and it seemed to bend in unnatural angles. Its limbs were too thin, almost skeletal, and its head was misshapen, a twisted mockery of a human face. Martin couldn't tear his eyes away, even as his mind screamed at him to drive, to get away. The deer didn't move. It stood perfectly still, like it was waiting for something. Then the figure took a step forward, moving with a fluid grace that shouldn't have been possible for something that large. Martin's hands were shaking as he tried to start the engine, but the car wouldn't respond. The battery was dead. The figure took another step, and another. It was getting closer now, its long limbs reaching toward the car. The deer stood as still as ever, its eyes glowing faintly in the headlights. Martin knew he wasn't going to escape. The air inside the car grew thick, as if the world outside was pressing in, suffocating him. Martin's heartbeat thundered in his ears, but it was drowned out by a deep, low hum, something that seemed to emanate from the figure, a noise not of this world. His hands fumbled for the door handle, but his body refused to move, paralyzed with fear. He could only stare as the figure inched closer, its shape distorting unnaturally with each movement. The deer, once a mere observer, now shifted slightly, its head tilted as though acknowledging the figure's approach. It was no longer the calm, still animal it had once been. Its eyes, now glowing brighter, reflected something darker, something that shouldn't have been seen in the wilds of the world. Martin's mind screamed to run, to do anything, but his body refused to obey. His breathing came in shallow gasps as the figure grew closer, its twisted limbs scraping against the earth like the sound of old wood cracking. The lights of his car flickered. For a moment, they flashed wildly, illuminating the figure in terrifying detail. Its eyes, if they could even be called eyes, were hollow voids of blackness with no reflection, no glint of life. Its skin was mottled and stretched, the texture almost translucent, revealing dark veins snaking beneath. And its face, though it resembled a grotesque human mask, seemed to shift and change, like it was made of 1,000 faces, none of them truly recognizable. A soft, unsettling whisper, like the rustling of leaves, filled the car. Martin didn't understand the words, but they felt like they were meant for him. They pressed against his mind, twisting it into shapes that didn't make sense. Suddenly, the car's engine sputtered to life, the engine roaring as if awakened by something ancient, something unseen. Martin slammed his foot down on the accelerator. The tires spun, screeching against the wet asphalt as he jerked the car forward, trying to escape. But it didn't matter how fast he drove, the figure didn't fade into the distance. Behind him, the deer still stood, its silhouette a dark shadow in the rearview mirror. And the figure, he could see it now, even as he sped away, even through the fog and rain, was still there. It was moving with impossible speed, keeping pace with him, as if it were right at his back, its twisted limbs matching every turn. Martin's breath quickened, panic starting to claw at him. The road ahead, once so familiar, now felt like a never-ending stretch of terror. He looked left, right, trying to find a turnoff, an escape. But everything was the same. Trees, darkness, rain. The figure had swallowed the road behind him, and he could feel its presence getting closer with every passing second. Suddenly, there was a sharp crack, a sound like the snapping of bones. He didn't know where it came from, but his hands tightened around the steering wheel. He looked up, realizing with horror that the road ahead was changing. The asphalt, once smooth and well-maintained, was now cracked, torn in places, as though something had ripped through it. The trees around him seemed to warp, growing taller and leaning in at unnatural angles. The world itself was shifting, distorting. The deer had disappeared. The figure was still behind him, too close now. Martin could feel it, could feel the cold, oppressive weight of its presence pushing against him, pressing against his very soul. He could hear the whispers again, clearer now, though they were still indecipherable. They weren't words anymore. They were thoughts, fragments of things that should never have been known. A flash of movement caught his eye. For a brief moment, he thought he saw something. A glimpse of a shape in the trees beside him, something tall and dark. But he couldn't focus. He couldn't allow himself to look away from the road. His heart was racing, his vision swimming with terror. Another crack. This time, it came from the front of the car. He slammed on the brakes, but the tires locked. The world outside blurred as the car skidded, the sound of metal scraping against stone ringing in his ears. The car came to a halt, just inches from the edge of the road. In the headlights, the twisted shape of the figure emerged. It was standing right in front of him, its face now inches away from the windshield, its hollow eyes staring into his soul. Its mouth, if it could even be called a mouth, opened slightly, and the words, those terrible, incomprehensible whispers, grew louder, more insistent. Martin couldn't breathe. He couldn't scream. The figure's face, now grotesque and misshapen, seemed to melt in front of him, the features shifting like wax under a flame. It leaned closer, its breath foul and hot against the glass, and he could feel it, pulling at the very core of his being. It was close now, too close, and then, without warning, the figure withdrew. The headlights flickered one last time, and the car jerked forward, as if pushed by some unseen force. The world around him spun in chaos, trees warping into shadows, the ground breaking apart. And in that instant, the figure was gone. The road, once cracked and torn, was smooth again. The air was still, the rain slowing to a drizzle. The headlights illuminated the quiet, empty road. The deer was gone, and Martin, he was alone. The silence around Martin was suffocating, a heavy, oppressive stillness that seemed to weigh on him from all sides. The only sound now was the faint dripping of rain from the trees above, but even that felt distant, like it was happening in another world. He sat frozen in the car, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles ached. His breathing came in shallow gasps, his heart hammering in his chest as he struggled to make sense of what had just happened. The world outside the car seemed to be holding its breath, waiting. Waiting for what? Martin didn't know. All he knew was that something had changed. The air felt wrong now, thick with an unseen tension. He glanced around, half expecting to see the figure again, but there was nothing. Just the road, stretching out in front of him, empty and calm. For a moment, he considered just driving away, getting back on the road and leaving whatever nightmare he had just experienced behind. But something, an instinct perhaps, kept him from moving. He couldn't shake the feeling that the figure was still out there, just beyond the edges of his sight, waiting for him to make a mistake. And worse, the sense that it had not truly left. Martin hesitated, then slowly reached for the door handle. His body screamed at him to stay inside, but his mind was louder. He needed to check, needed to know if what he had seen was real. With a deep breath, he opened the door, the cold night air rushing in. His feet hit the ground with a soft thud, and he stood, his legs weak beneath him. The world felt off-kilter, as though the ground itself was subtly shifting. The trees around him swayed unnaturally, their branches bending in odd directions. The road, which had seemed so familiar before, now looked distorted, as though it was part of a dream or a nightmare. Martin's head spun with the realization that the landscape around him no longer made sense. The horizon had no end. The trees were too tall, their shadows too long. The night sky seemed too dark, too oppressive. He was no longer sure where the road was leading, or if it had ever been real. And then he heard it, a low, guttural noise, coming from the woods on his left. It was like the sound of something large dragging itself through the underbrush, something moving with unnatural force. His breath caught in his throat, and he instinctively took a step back toward the car. His mind screamed for him to get back inside, to lock the doors and drive away, but his body wouldn't cooperate. He stood frozen, listening, the air thick with dread. The sound grew louder, closer. There was no mistaking it now. Something was moving in the trees. Something huge, something deliberate. Martin's eyes darted around, but the darkness made it impossible to see anything clearly. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end as the air grew colder. He felt the weight of something watching him, waiting. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the sound stopped. The forest fell quiet again, but the silence felt even more suffocating than before. Martin's heart was racing now, the adrenaline coursing through his veins. He didn't know what to do. His instincts screamed at him to run, but his feet felt glued to the ground. He glanced at the car, but the headlights were still on, casting long, eerie shadows across the road. Suddenly, a sharp crack sounded from behind him. The noise was so loud it made him jump, his heart skipping a beat. He spun around, eyes wide with terror, but there was nothing there. No movement, no sounds, just the stillness of the dark forest. Then he saw it. A shape, no, something, standing just at the edge of the road. It was tall, unnaturally so, and its form seemed to shimmer in the dim light from the car. It was hard to make out any details, but the silhouette was unmistakable. It was too tall, too lanky, too wrong. The way it stood there, unmoving, was enough to make Martin's blood run cold. The shape didn't move. It didn't make a sound. But Martin knew it was watching him, its gaze like a physical weight pressing down on him. He felt it in his bones. He could feel its presence, just beyond his line of sight, lurking in the darkness. His breath hitched as a cold gust of wind blew through the trees, rustling the leaves around him. The figure remained motionless, but something about it felt alive, watching, waiting for the right moment to move. Martin's heart pounded louder in his chest, each beat seeming to echo through the stillness of the night. Every instinct he had screamed at him to run, to get away, but his body wouldn't respond. He was trapped in place, frozen in fear, unable to tear his eyes away from the shape. Suddenly, it moved. The motion was impossibly fast, blurring with speed as it closed the distance between them in an instant. Martin barely had time to react before the thing was right in front of him, standing so close that he could feel its presence like a physical weight. The air grew colder still, and for the briefest of moments, their gazes locked. The figure's face was indistinguishable in the shadows, but Martin could feel the hatred radiating from it, thick and palpable. It was a thing that should not exist in the world, something born from nightmares, a creature beyond comprehension. And just like that, it was gone. The world around Martin snapped back to normal, the figure vanishing into the night like smoke, leaving only a lingering sense of dread. The trees were still, the wind had stopped, and the road was quiet again. But Martin knew that whatever he had just experienced wasn't over. The figure had gone, yes, but it had not left. And it would be back. It always would. The question was, when? Martin stood still, his breath ragged, his heart hammering in his chest. The world around him seemed too quiet now, too still, as though the very air had been sucked out of the night. His mind screamed at him to run, to get in the car and leave this place, but his body refused to move. Every part of him was locked in place, unable to process what had just happened. He glanced over his shoulder toward the car, the headlights still shining brightly into the darkness. The road was empty, the trees swaying gently in the wind, their leaves rustling in the distance. It almost seemed like everything was normal again, like the thing that had just been standing in front of him had been some twisted figment of his imagination. But Martin knew better than to trust his eyes now. The unease gnawed at him from the inside out. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, something watching him from the shadows. He felt it in the pit of his stomach, a cold, nauseating sense of dread that clung to him like a second skin. His mind raced, replaying the encounter over and over. That shape so tall, so unnatural, and the way it had moved so impossibly fast, as if it had bent the very laws of nature. It had been like a shadow, but it had been real, and it had been aware. He wasn't imagining it. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't just some trick of the mind. It was something real, something that lived in the dark corners of the world. He couldn't stay here, not like this. Slowly, his legs began to move, and he turned back toward the car. The rain had started to fall heavier now, drumming against the roof of the car in a rhythmic patter, as if to remind him of the world he was still connected to. He reached for the door handle with trembling fingers, but just as his hand brushed against it, a noise stopped him dead in his tracks. A sound, faint at first, barely audible over the rain, but unmistakable. It was a scraping noise, like something dragging across the ground, something heavy, something slow. It was coming from behind him. Martin's breath hitched, his blood turning to ice. He didn't dare turn around. He didn't want to see whatever it was, didn't want to acknowledge the terror creeping up his spine. But the sound was getting closer, dragging closer, like something was stalking him from the woods. A low, guttural sound, as though something was struggling to move. His legs finally responded to the instinct to flee. He threw open the door and jumped into the driver's seat, slamming it shut behind him. His hands shook as he fumbled for the keys in his pocket, his mind racing. He could hear the scraping now, unmistakable and unrelenting, as though whatever it was right behind the car. He turned the ignition, the engine sputtering to life, and slammed his foot down on the gas. The car lurched forward, tires spinning on the wet road. Martin's breath came in ragged bursts as he sped down the road, glancing nervously in the rearview mirror. The world behind him was nothing but rain and shadows, but the scraping noise had stopped. It was almost as if the thing had let him go, as if it was waiting for something. He couldn't bring himself to look back. His foot pressed harder on the gas pedal, pushing the car faster as the trees blurred past. He needed to get away. He didn't know where the road was taking him anymore. He just needed to get away from this place, from whatever had been lurking in the woods. The rain fell in sheets now, the windshield wipers struggling to keep up with the downpour. The headlights barely illuminated the road ahead of him, but it didn't matter. He couldn't focus on the road anymore. His mind kept drifting back to the woods, to that thing, to the sound that had followed him. It was still out there somewhere, watching, waiting. But as Martin drove, something in the distance caught his attention. A shape, something just barely visible through the veil of rain. It was standing at the edge of the road, right where the trees thinned out, right where the curve of the road led into a narrow, dark tunnel. His heart skipped a beat. It was a deer, a large, dark shape, standing still in the middle of the road. Its body was unnaturally still, too still. The rain glistened on its coat, but there was something wrong about it. Its eyes, if they could even be called eyes, were empty black voids, hollow and unblinking, staring straight into Martin's. For a brief moment, Martin wondered if he was hallucinating. But as he got closer, he saw that the deer didn't move. It didn't even flinch as the car barreled toward it. The headlights illuminated its dark, empty gaze, and Martin slammed his foot on the brakes. The car skidded, tires screeching as the vehicle jerked to a halt just inches from the deer. Martin's breath caught in his throat, his heart pounding wildly in his chest. He could hear the steady drip of rain on the roof, the only sound breaking the heavy silence that had enveloped the car. And then, to his horror, the deer began to move. Not in the way a deer should, not with the graceful, fluid motion of an animal running or jumping. No, the deer's movements were jerky, unnatural, as though it were struggling to keep itself upright. Its head tilted to the side, and it began to slowly walk toward the car, its hooves scraping against the wet pavement with that same terrible dragging noise he had heard earlier. Martin's breath caught in his throat, his hands shaking as he gripped the steering wheel. The deer didn't blink, didn't look away. Its black eyes were locked on him, unwavering, as it drew closer. The air in the car seemed to grow colder. The rain didn't seem to touch the windshield anymore. All that mattered, all that existed in that moment, was the deer and its hollow gaze. He could feel the panic rising in his chest as the thing drew closer. Every instinct in his body told him to drive away, to escape this nightmare. But the car wouldn't move. The engine was still running, but the car remained motionless. It was as if the deer had stopped him, trapped him in place. Martin's breathing became shallow as the creature reached the front of the car. Its head tilted farther to one side, and it leaned in close to the windshield. The smell of wet earth and decay filled the air, nauseating and thick. And then the deer spoke. "You're mine now." The words were so low, so guttural, that Martin almost didn't believe his own ears. But they echoed in his mind, louder than any sound he had ever heard. His hands gripped the wheel so tightly his fingers ached, but the world around him was already slipping away. Martin's pulse raced as he stared at the creature, unable to comprehend what had just happened. The words that had come from its mouth weren't natural. They weren't the words of an animal, and they weren't the words of anything human. It was as if the very air around him had thickened with a malevolent presence, suffocating him with its weight. The deer's black eyes never wavered. It stood just inches from the windshield, its breath fogging up the glass as it leaned closer. The low, guttural growl it emitted seemed to vibrate in his chest, reverberating like the sound of distant thunder. For a moment, time seemed to stretch, each second dragging on in agonizing slow motion. The only sound Martin could hear was his own shallow breathing and the deafening silence of the night around him. "You're mine now," the words echoed in his mind, and a cold shiver ran down his spine. He had to get out of there. He had to drive away to escape whatever this thing was. But his body didn't respond. His fingers were frozen on the steering wheel, his foot still pressed against the brake. The car paralyzed as if some invisible force had taken hold of it. He glanced back at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something else lurking behind him, something worse than the creature in front of him. But the road was empty. The rain blurred the view, and the darkness beyond the headlights swallowed everything in its grasp. The deer took another slow step forward, its hooves scraping against the pavement, dragging the horrible, dragging sound that seemed to rattle his bones. Martin's throat went dry as his eyes locked onto the creature's face, unable to look away. He couldn't tell if it was still a deer. No, not anymore. It was something else. Something dark, something ancient. The creature's mouth curled upward into a grotesque, twisted smile that sent a jolt of pure terror through his body. And then, as if responding to his terror, the car shook. Just a subtle tremor at first, but it quickly grew in intensity, rattling the windows and sending a wave of dread through Martin's entire being. The dashboard flickered, and the lights dimmed. Without thinking, Martin slammed his foot down on the accelerator. The car lurched forward, tires screeching as it shot away from the deer. But the world around him didn't change. The road blurred past, but something was wrong. The road, the trees, the rain. It all looked the same. The landscape was shifting, warping, but it was all the same. Endless, dark, and empty. His hands gripped the steering wheel tighter as he glanced frantically around. The headlights barely cut through the darkness anymore. The rain seemed to have intensified, turning into a torrential downpour that obscured everything beyond the windshield. But then he saw it. A set of eyes. Two glowing, black orbs staring back at him from the side of the road. A second deer. No, it wasn't a deer. It was something else. It stood motionless in the shadows, hidden just enough that he could see only the outline of its dark, twisted body. The eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and he could feel them watching him, waiting. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. He drove faster. He had to get away. This wasn't real. None of it was real. He had to be dreaming, or he was hallucinating from the exhaustion, from the fear, from everything. He couldn't afford to look at it. He couldn't afford to stop. But as his gaze darted back to the road ahead, another figure appeared. The third, and another. They were scattered along the roadside, each with those same glowing eyes, staring at him with a hunger he couldn't even begin to fathom. The road was no longer just a road. It was a trap that he had driven into, and he couldn't escape. The car sputtered, its engine coughing and stalling. Panic surged through him, and he slammed his foot onto the gas pedal, but nothing happened. The car had stopped. The creatures in the shadows were closer now, surrounding him on all sides. He could see them better now, their forms shifting and contorting in ways that no living creature should be able to move. They were tall, impossibly tall, their limbs elongated, like twisted reflections of something that had once been alive. Their eyes were hollow and empty, yet full of a cold, predatory hunger. Their mouths parted in silent screams, their gaping jaws filled with rows of sharp, needle-like teeth. One of them stepped forward, its elongated fingers scraping across the side of the car. It didn't make a sound, but Martin could feel its presence pressing in on him. His pulse pounded in his ears, the fear choking him. "You're not leaving." The voice came from all around him, a chorus of low, rumbling growls and whispers that seemed to seep from the very walls of the car. The world outside the windows darkened, the shadows closing in. Martin pressed his hands against the wheel, desperate to escape, to do anything. But his body had gone numb. He couldn't move. The creatures were closer now, and their hollow eyes bore into him like 1,000 pinpricks of ice. He could feel the cold creeping into his bones. The rain pounded against the car, and in the thick darkness, something moved in the back seat. Martin's breath caught in his throat as the sound from the back seat grew louder. A soft scraping, almost like the sound of fingernails dragging across fabric. He couldn't turn around, couldn't bring himself to face whatever it was, yet he could feel its presence pressing in, inch by inch. His fingers trembled against the steering wheel as he glanced at the rearview mirror, half afraid to look. The empty reflection mocked him, offering no answers, only a deeper silence that clawed at his mind. Every nerve in his body screamed at him to move, but he was frozen, paralyzed by the uncertainty of what waited behind him. The scraping stopped. The silence that followed was almost worse. He was no longer alone. Martin's eyes darted around, searching for any escape, but the road stretched out in front of him, endless and unfamiliar. The creatures, those twisted beings with their glowing eyes, had closed in further, standing just inches away from the car. He could see their silhouettes shifting, their unnatural forms twitching with something far beyond human comprehension. Suddenly, the backseat door creaked open. Slowly, the metal scraping against metal seemed to echo through his skull, and his heart thundered in his chest. Don't look back. But it was no use. His body moved before he could stop it. He twisted his head, eyes wide in terror as he saw it. What was once a shadow, now fully formed. It was crouched in the back seat, hunched over, with those same black, soulless eyes staring directly at him. Its face, if it could even be called that, was pale, almost sickly, its skin stretched taut over bone. The mouth opened, revealing rows of jagged, broken teeth, sharp and glinting in the dim light. It wasn't human. It never had been. The car jolted again, this time not from the engine's failure, but from the force of something slamming into the vehicle's side. The sound of metal bending and screeching filled the cabin, and Martin felt the car shift sideways. His heart leapt into his throat as the pressure mounted, the weight of something immense pushing against the vehicle. The creature in the back seat hissed, a low, guttural sound that made Martin's skin crawl. It tilted its head slightly, as though inspecting him, its black eyes narrowing. "Leave, now," it whispered, its voice rasping, not quite human, not quite animal. The words sent a chill through his entire being, and for the first time since this nightmare began, Martin felt the overwhelming pull of terror, a primal urge to flee, to escape whatever this was. He yanked the gear shift into drive, slamming his foot down on the accelerator. The car lurched forward again, its wheels screeching against the wet pavement. But the pressure from the side didn't relent. The creatures, if that's what they were still there, pushing against him. He could feel the car being forced off the road, its tires struggling to find grip. The headlights flickered erratically as if the world itself was turning against him. Rain lashed at the windshield in sheets, blurring the road ahead until he couldn't see anything at all. The air was thick with an unnatural fog, the kind that made the world seem smaller, more suffocating. He couldn't stop. He couldn't give in. But the more he fought against the pull of the road, the stronger it seemed to grow. The creatures weren't just on the outside. They were inside his mind, scratching at the edges of his sanity. They had been following him, stalking him from the moment he had driven down this twisted path, and now they were inside, like a virus infecting his thoughts. The world around him started to warp. The trees on the side of the road began to twist and bend, their shapes shifting into grotesque forms, like unnatural faces stretching toward him. The rain intensified, hammering against the car like nails driven into wood. The darkness outside deepened, suffocating the world in a black void. Suddenly, the creature in the back seat lunged forward with inhuman speed, its claws scraping across the seat as it pressed closer. Martin's heart exploded in his chest as he slammed on the brakes. The car screeched to a halt, the tires grinding to a stop as the creature's face came inches from his own, its putrid breath fogging up the glass. "You can't run forever," it whispered, its voice like a wet rasp against his ear. Martin's body went cold. There was no escaping, no way out. The road stretched endlessly, twisting and curling in ways that shouldn't have been possible. The creatures were everywhere, everywhere in the fog, in the trees, on the road, in his mind. The car shuddered again as something heavy crashed against the roof, followed by a deafening crack. The roof caved in slightly, the metal bending under the pressure. Panic surged through him as he realized he was no longer in control. Something clawed at the door, pulling at it, trying to get inside. The door handle snapped off with a sickening crack, and the metal groaned as if the car itself were screaming. Every instinct told him to run, but there was no place to run to, no place to hide. The creature's clawed hand slowly reached across the seat, its fingers curling toward him. Martin's breath was caught in his throat as he reached for the door handle, but his body was frozen in place. It was happening again. It was happening, and this time there was no escape. The creature's fingers brushed against Martin's shoulder, sending a sharp chill through his body. He could feel the heat of its touch seeping through his jacket, its grip tightening as if to pull him into the nightmare that awaited him outside. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat a thunderous echo in his ears. He didn't know what to do, didn't know where to go, as the world around him collapsed into a blur of darkness and chaos. The creature's other hand emerged, clawing at the seat, its eyes glowing brighter now, burning with a hunger that seemed insatiable. Martin tried to push the door open, but it was locked. Panic set in, his breath coming in quick, ragged gasps. His hands trembled as they searched for the keys in his pocket, the metal digging into his skin. He didn't even hear the click of the ignition turning over until the engine roared back to life, the engine sputtering and coughing as it tried to power up. But before he could make any move to drive, the creature pressed its face against the window. Its mouth stretched impossibly wide, the jagged teeth clattering against the glass, and its breath fogged up the surface. "You should have stayed away," it hissed. The words sent a wave of dread through Martin, but before he could react, the car lurched violently to the side again, and the world outside seemed to warp in ways that didn't make sense. The rain came down in sheets, but it wasn't water. It was dark, viscous, and thick, like tar falling from the sky. His wipers struggled against the sticky substance as it smeared across the glass, making it harder to see. The road, if it could still be called that, wasn't the same. It had become something else, twisting into an unrecognizable labyrinth that made no sense. The trees were bent and deformed, their trunks gnarled and clawed, like the hands of some forgotten god trying to reach into his world. Martin's hands gripped the wheel, knuckles white, and the car screamed down the road, tires sliding across the wet surface as he tried to control it. The fog rolled in thicker, smothering everything around him, and the darkness grew deeper, like a living thing trying to swallow him whole. In the rearview mirror, Martin saw movement. Something small, something creeping toward him. His eyes widened in horror as he caught a glimpse of it. A twisted, contorted version of what once was a deer. Its body was unnaturally long, its legs bent in ways that couldn't possibly be natural. Its face, no, its head, was a mess of broken, jagged bone and skin, hollowed eyes staring into the rearview mirror with a soul-shattering emptiness. It was following him. No, it was more than that. It was hunting him. "Turn around," the voice from the back seat whispered again, this time louder, more forceful. His eyes darted to the mirror. The creature was gone, but its reflection lingered. That twisted deer was there, its eyes gleaming in the mist like two burning embers. It had crossed the road. Somehow it had shifted, crossed from one side to the other impossibly fast, almost like it had never been bound by the laws of reality. "Turn around." The voice seemed to resonate through his head now, not just in his ears. It was everywhere. It was in the air, in the tires, in the rain falling in sheets. It was seeping into him, crawling under his skin. "Turn around." Martin's hands tightened on the wheel, his breath caught in his throat as the urge to look back intensified. His foot hovered over the brake. For a split second, he thought he could feel the grip of the creature's claws again, the pressure of it bearing down on him. The road stretched on endlessly, winding and curling. He couldn't turn back. He couldn't. The wiper blades scraped across the windshield as if fighting a battle against the tar-like rain. He glanced at the side mirror. The road was empty, but the fear gnawing at him, relentless, palpable, told him otherwise. A sudden crash of thunder split the air. Martin slammed on the brakes, the car jolting to a halt. There, in front of him, stood the deer. No, it wasn't a deer anymore. It was something else, something far worse. The creature's body seemed to melt and shift, elongating and twisting, bones cracking in ways they shouldn't have. Its grotesque form now much larger than it ever should have been. Its head, that twisted mockery of an animal's face, turned slowly toward him, its eyes gleaming with malice. The car stalled. The lights flickered. Everything in the world slowed, as if time had stopped just for this moment. The deer, no, whatever it had become, started to move toward him, its twisted legs dragging across the road, splintering the asphalt as it came closer. "You shouldn't have come here," it whispered, its voice now something more ancient, something far older than he could understand. Martin's heart raced in his chest, his breath coming in shallow gasps. His hands were slick with sweat, his body frozen in place. And then the world began to crumble. The ground beneath him cracked, the earth splitting open as the creature lunged forward, its twisted form now so close he could hear the rasp of its breath against the night air. The creature's presence felt like an oppressive force, its twisted body casting long shadows across the car as it crawled closer. Each movement was slow, deliberate, as if savoring the fear it was instilling in Martin. The air grew thick, almost suffocating, and the once crisp sound of the rain hitting the car was now drowned by an unsettling silence, broken only by the faint scratching of its claws against the asphalt. Martin's heart thudded loudly in his chest, but no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't bring himself to move. His foot, seemingly of its own volition, pressed against the gas pedal. But the car didn't budge. The creature's head tilted, its grotesque eyes narrowing as it studied him. Time seemed to stretch indefinitely, each second feeling like an eternity as it inched closer, its body elongating unnaturally with every step. "You've come too far," it whispered again, the voice a hiss that resonated deep within Martin's mind. The words felt like poison, slipping into his thoughts, twisting them, manipulating them. Suddenly, the car lurched forward on its own, tires spinning as the creature closed the gap. The engine roared in protest, the headlights flickering erratically as they lit up the twisted form of the creature, its skin glistening in the dim light like wet leather. A low, guttural growl reverberated through the ground as it moved closer, filling the air with a sense of impending doom. Martin's fingers twitched on the wheel, trying to regain control, but his body felt like lead, his limbs frozen in place. The creature was mere feet away now. Its breath fogged up the windshield, and its clawed hand reached out, tapping against the glass as though testing its limits. The wipers continued to swipe frantically, the tar-like rain blurring his vision even further. He could barely make out the shape of the thing, but the eyes, they were the most terrifying part. There was something ancient and malevolent behind those hollow, black pits. They seemed to promise endless torment, a fate far worse than death. With a sudden burst of strength, Martin slammed his foot onto the gas pedal. The car shot forward, its tires screeching in protest, but it didn't matter. He had to get away. The car sped down the road, the engine roaring louder than before, but every turn, every curve, only seemed to make things worse. The road had warped once again. The trees that lined the sides were now distorted, twisted into grotesque shapes that reached out like monstrous hands. The road, once a clear path, now seemed to twist in impossible directions, narrowing and widening at random. The creature, however, wasn't far behind. Its movements were unnatural, as though it was both there and not there at the same time. One moment it was closing in on him from the left, and the next it appeared in the rearview mirror, its eyes locked onto his. The distance between them was closing, and no matter how fast he drove, it seemed to be matching his speed, relentless in its pursuit. The world outside the car was no longer a familiar road. It had turned into a nightmare, an endless expanse of dark, oppressive trees and twisted, distorted paths. The sky was an unnatural shade of black, swirling with storm clouds that seemed to pulse with malevolent energy. Panic surged through Martin's chest as he glanced at the gas gauge. It was nearing empty. He could see the glow of the red warning light flickering in the corner of his eye, a cruel reminder that time was running out. He couldn't outrun it forever. Desperation crept into his mind, and he knew that if he didn't find a way out soon, there would be no escape. The creature, though invisible to the naked eye at times, was still there, lurking just behind him, breathing heavily, waiting. It was relentless, its presence a constant weight on his shoulders. Then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the road ahead of him began to distort further, twisting in on itself until the asphalt became a writhing mass of tar and broken stone. The headlights flickered wildly, casting eerie shadows on the trees that seemed to move with a life of their own. The trees swayed in a rhythm, as if they were breathing. He slammed his foot on the brake, the car skidding as it tried to stop, but the road had turned into something impossible, a living thing that pulsed with an unnatural energy. The tires couldn't grip onto the shifting surface. He was spiraling, falling into the darkness, and there was no escape. Suddenly, everything around him went still. A deafening silence settled over the car. The engine sputtered and died, the lights flickering out completely, leaving Martin in total darkness. His breath quickened in the pitch black, the shadows around him seemingly growing thicker, pressing in. In the utter silence, the sound of breathing slow, ragged, and deep filled the car. It wasn't his breath. It wasn't his own. The air grew colder, the chill crawling down his spine. He could feel something in the darkness, something right behind him, waiting. The breath was so close now that it felt like a cold gust against his neck. His skin crawled, and his eyes flicked toward the rearview mirror again, but there was nothing there. Only the oppressive blackness. A soft, low growl echoed from behind him, sending a surge of terror through his body. It was then that he realized he had been wrong. It had never been about outrunning it. It was always about surviving the waiting. The growl intensified, vibrating the very core of Martin's being. It was a low, guttural sound, the kind that rattles your bones and makes your skin crawl. His heart thumped loudly in his chest, drowning out all other sound, as he tried to push open the door of the car. But his hands shook so violently he couldn't grip the handle. The cold breath on his neck was becoming unbearable now, like ice sinking into his flesh. A presence, darker than any shadow, pressed against him, and he knew. It was inside the car now. The darkness around him wasn't just the absence of light. It was an entity, something far older than human understanding, something that thrived on fear, on panic. Suddenly, the car jolted, shaking violently as though something enormous was scraping along the sides. The metal screamed in protest, the sound searing through the air like nails on a chalkboard. Martin's panic surged into overdrive. He had to get out. He had to survive. Desperate, he lunged for the handle again, this time succeeding. The door flew open, slamming into the side of the car as he scrambled out. The world outside the car was no better. The road had completely disappeared. He was standing on a cracked surface, blackened and charred, stretching endlessly into the horizon. The air was thick with fog, swirling with strange, faint whispers, his name, echoing from all directions. He tried to run, his legs unresponsive, as though they were bound by some invisible force. His feet stumbled over jagged stones, and the fog swallowed him whole. But the growl, that horrible, deep growl, was still there. It wasn't behind him anymore. It was all around him. "You shouldn't have come here," the voice hissed again, and this time it was unmistakably coming from the fog itself. It wrapped around his mind, his thoughts, pulling them apart as he tried to focus on anything other than the growing sense of dread. His lungs burned as he gasped for air, his eyes darting wildly around, searching for any sign of escape. And that's when he saw it, the eyes. They weren't glowing, but they burned like holes in the very fabric of reality. At first, just one pair, then another and another, dozens of them staring at him from the fog. They were not animal eyes, not human. They were eyes of something else, something ancient, something hungry. The presence was everywhere now. The ground beneath his feet trembled as the fog thickened, swirling violently around him. The temperature dropped, and the hairs on his neck stood straight up. He was no longer alone. He was surrounded by darkness, and it was waiting. With a final, defiant scream, Martin turned and ran, his legs barely moving, as though the very air itself was trying to slow him down. The whispers were louder now, echoing in his mind, drowning out all reason. The fog closed in faster, the dark eyes watching him, waiting for him to slip. And then, just as he thought he couldn't run any longer, the ground beneath him gave way. His body fell weightless for a moment, before crashing into something soft and cold. He tried to scream, but the air was gone, suffocated by an invisible force pressing down on him. His arms flailed, but the darkness closed in around him, pushing him deeper into a cold, empty void. The last thing he felt before everything went still, before his mind faded to nothing, was the chilling touch of something cold against his skin. The fog swallowed him whole, and the road was silent once again. The end. The road stretched endlessly into the night, its asphalt cracked and faded beneath the glow of faded headlights. Lisa tightened her grip on the steering wheel, the rhythmic hum of her tires the only sound cutting through the oppressive silence. Her phone, mounted to the dashboard, displayed a flickering GPS map, the bright red, no signal bar mocking her. Just a shortcut, she muttered under her breath. Save a couple of hours. Stupid idea. The moon hung low in the sky, casting a sickly pallor over the desolate landscape. Nothing but endless rows of skeletal trees lined the sides of the road. They bent and twisted in the faint breeze, their branches clawing at the sky like desperate hands. The isolation felt suffocating. She hadn't seen another car in hours, and the static on the radio had become an unwanted companion. Every station she tried offered the same grating buzz. She finally switched it off, letting silence settle like a heavy blanket. As the miles ticked by, her unease grew. The scenery outside began to repeat. First, she thought it was her mind playing tricks on her. A particular gnarled tree or a cluster of rocks looked eerily familiar. Then she passed an abandoned gas station with a broken neon sign. 30 minutes later, the same station appeared again. Her foot eased off the gas and she slowed to a stop. The headlights illuminated the road ahead, but it looked no different from the miles she'd just traveled. She opened her phone again, hoping for even the faintest bar of service, but the screen remained empty. A faint sound broke the silence, the rhythmic tap of footsteps on asphalt. Lisa's breath caught in her throat, and she snapped her head toward the rearview mirror. The road was empty. She rolled down the window, straining to hear. "Hello," she called, her voice trembling. The sound stopped abruptly, leaving only the oppressive silence in its wake. She rolled the window back up and locked the doors, her heart hammering. As she pressed the accelerator, the headlights illuminated a figure standing in the middle of the road ahead. It was motionless, its face obscured by shadows, but the way it stood, too still, too rigid, made the hairs on her arms stand on end. "Move!" she shouted, gripping the wheel tightly. The figure tilted its head unnaturally to one side, then the other. Slowly, deliberately, it raised an arm to point directly at her. Lisa slammed the car into reverse, her tires screeching as she backed away. But when she looked behind her, the figure was there too, standing in the road where she'd stopped minutes ago. They were identical. She was trapped. Panic crept up Lisa's spine like a cold, slithering hand. She frantically looked around the car, searching for any escape, but the roads around her were endless and empty. There was no turning back, no way forward. Her eyes flicked back to the figure ahead. It hadn't moved, but she could feel it watching her, waiting. The eerie stillness pressed against her chest, the air growing thick with something far more sinister than the usual nighttime quiet. The tapping sound returned. The footsteps, now unmistakable, echoed from the darkness just behind her. Her eyes whipped to the rearview mirror. The figure was still standing where she had last seen it, motionless, but there was something else now. Another shape had appeared, moving quickly along the shoulder of the road. A shadow darted across the beams of her headlights, its shape contorting unnaturally as it ran. Lisa's breathing became shallow. She turned the wheel, her heart racing as she attempted to speed past the first figure. But as the headlights swept over it again, the face was now visible, or at least what should have been a face. A pale, smooth surface. No eyes, no mouth, just an empty void where a person's face should be. It stared at her, lifeless and unblinking. Lisa gasped and slammed on the brakes, her hands shaking as she tried to regain control. She needed to go. She needed to get away. The darkness outside was closing in, and she could feel the oppressive weight of something ancient pressing against her. She threw the car in reverse again, her foot slamming the gas pedal with desperate force. The car shot backward, tires screeching, but the figures were still there, their shapes lingering in the headlights like ghosts trapped in a place they could never leave. In her panic, Lisa didn't notice the patch of slick black ice beneath her tires. The car slid to one side, veering toward the trees. She gripped the wheel, attempting to right the vehicle, but it was no use. The steering wheel jerked violently in her hands, sending the car spinning out of control. Her heart pounded as the car spun through the icy night, its headlights flashing erratically across the dark landscape. The car finally slammed into something solid, a tree, but not just any tree. This one was enormous, its bark twisted and black, almost like it had been waiting for her. The impact left Lisa breathless, her head spinning from the sudden jolt. She tried to collect herself, blinking against the dizziness, but the world outside was no longer what it had been. The trees around her were moving. They didn't sway with the wind. They shifted, as though they were alive. Their branches stretched out, as if reaching for the car, clawing toward her in an unholy dance. Her breath caught in her throat as the tree she had crashed into started to twist and groan, as though it was alive, too. Lisa didn't wait to see what would happen next. She unbuckled her seatbelt, her hands fumbling as she desperately pulled herself free from the wreckage. She pushed open the door, her body shaking from shock, and stumbled out into the cold, icy air. She didn't look back as she ran, her feet slipping on the slick ground. The night around her was pitch black, the only sound the crackling of trees shifting and the echo of footsteps chasing her, each one growing closer, faster. Somewhere, in the distance, she heard a voice, a whisper, a name. Lisa. She froze mid-step, the chill of the night creeping under her skin. She whipped around, her breath coming in ragged gasps. No one was there. She turned back toward the trees, her eyes scanning the dark shapes looming ahead. The air smelled wrong, like decay and rot, and Lisa could feel the weight of something pressing against her chest. Her pulse raced. The whisper came again. Lisa. It was closer now, louder, a voice she knew, but that wasn't possible. It wasn't just a voice. There was something else in the air, something ancient, malevolent, that had been waiting for her. And as the first figures emerged from the darkness, their faces still blank and empty, Lisa knew one thing with terrifying clarity. There was no escape. Lisa's instincts screamed for her to run, but her body betrayed her. She stood frozen, staring at the figures advancing from the shadows. Their movements were jerky, unnatural, as though they were marionettes being controlled by some unseen force. The voice called her name again, but this time it wasn't a whisper. It was a chorus, multiple voices, overlapping and echoing, each one a distorted mockery of familiarity. Lisa, Lyisa. The sounds seemed to come from everywhere at once, bouncing off the trees and crawling into her ears. She clamped her hands over her head, trying to shut it out, but the voices only grew louder, filling her mind with their insidious chant. The figures surrounded her now, their faceless heads tilting in unison as if studying her. One of them raised an arm, its movements slow and deliberate, pointing toward the twisted black tree where her car lay crumpled. Lisa's gaze followed the gesture, and her stomach churned. The car was no longer just a wreck. It had become a part of the tree. Its metal frame had fused with the bark, its windows coated in a slick, black sap. The headlights flickered weakly, like the last breaths of a dying creature. The tree itself seemed alive, its branches writhing like snakes. From the base of its trunk, something oozed, a dark, viscous substance that pooled around its roots and crept toward her. The air smelled of sulfur and rot, and Lisa gagged, stumbling back. The chanting stopped. Silence fell over the forest like a heavy blanket, suffocating and oppressive. Then the tree groaned. Lisa watched in horror as the bark split open, revealing a hollow cavity. Inside, something moved, a pulsating mass of shadows and light, swirling and twisting in ways that defied logic. From within the cavity, a hand emerged. It was not human. Its skin was translucent, its fingers too long and jointed in unnatural places. The hand gripped the edge of the hollow, pulling something out. Lisa turned to run, her feet slipping on the icy ground, but the figures were there, blocking her path. They closed in, their featureless faces tilted toward her. She screamed, her voice echoing into the night, but it was swallowed by the forest. The thing from the tree stepped out. Its body was like smoke, shifting and reforming with every step. Where its face should have been, there was only a swirling void. It reached toward Lisa, and for a moment, everything around her seemed to stop. The wind, the figures, even her own breathing. The world froze as the creature's hand hovered inches from her chest. Then it touched her. Lisa's scream died in her throat as a searing pain erupted in her chest. It wasn't physical. It was deeper, as though the creature was reaching into her very essence, pulling something out. She fell to her knees, her vision swimming as the world around her blurred and darkened. The creature tilted its head, as if curious, and withdrew its hand. In its palm, something glimmered, a shard of light, pulsating faintly. Lisa gasped, clutching her chest, but the pain didn't subside. The figures began to chant again, their voices low and rhythmic. The sound reverberated through the forest, growing louder and more intense, until it felt as though the very ground beneath her was shaking. The creature raised the shard of light above its head, and the chanting reached a crescendo. Lisa tried to stand, to fight, but her body wouldn't obey. She could only watch as the shard dissolved into the void where the creature's face should have been. The forest went silent again. The figures turned and began to dissolve, their forms dissipating like mist. The creature stepped back into the hollow of the tree, its form merging with the shadows. Lisa collapsed onto the cold, damp ground, her vision fading. As the darkness closed in, the last thing she heard was the tree's groan, like a door slamming shut. Lisa woke to an eerie stillness. The chill in the air was sharper, biting into her skin. She was lying in the same spot where she had collapsed, but the forest felt wrong. The trees were still there, but they no longer looked natural. Their trunks spiraled unnaturally, and their branches twisted into jagged shapes that clawed at the sky. The ground beneath her was soft, almost spongy, and pulsated faintly with each breath she took. Her chest still ached, but when she placed a trembling hand over it, she felt nothing unusual, no wound, no mark. Yet, something inside her was missing. The absence was palpable, like a part of her soul had been carved away. She staggered to her feet, her legs trembling, and turned toward the tree where the creature had disappeared. It was gone. The gnarled black trunk had smoothed into an unnaturally polished surface, reflective like obsidian. She caught her distorted reflection in its surface, pale, disheveled, and utterly foreign. Her eyes looked hollow, their usual spark replaced by a faint, unnatural glow. A sound broke the silence. It was faint at first, like the whisper of wind through leaves, but it grew louder, becoming a chorus of whispers. Words overlapped, some intelligible, others garbled and wrong. Lisa turned in circles, trying to pinpoint the source, but it was everywhere. Return. The shard, the phrase repeated, weaving through the cacophony, sinking into her mind. She clutched her head, trying to block it out, but the whispers only grew louder. They were coming from the trees, from the ground, from inside her own head. Lisa stumbled away, desperate to escape, but no matter where she turned, The forest closed in around her. The path she had been following was gone, replaced by endless rows of warped trees. The whispers followed her, relentless and growing more insistent. Ahead, a faint light flickered through the trees. Hope surged in her chest, and she pushed forward, crashing through the underbrush. As she drew closer, the light resolved into the glow of a dilapidated gas station, its flickering neon sign barely illuminating the clearing around it. She ran toward it, her breath hitching with relief. The door creaked open as she shoved her way inside, slamming it shut behind her. The station was empty, its shelves lined with dusty cans and faded labels. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows that seemed to move on their own. "Hello!" Lisa called out, her voice hoarse and trembling. No response. The whispers didn't follow her inside, but the silence was no comfort. She approached the counter, her eyes scanning the dim room for any sign of life. A faint movement caught her attention. Behind the counter, a figure sat slumped in a chair, its back to her. Relief flooded her chest as she stepped closer. "Please, I need help," she said, her voice cracking. The figure didn't move. "Hello!" Lisa reached out, her hand trembling, and touched its shoulder. The figure turned slowly, its head lolling unnaturally. Lisa screamed. The face was wrong, its features distorted and rearranged as if someone had molded it like clay. Its eyes were wide and empty, its mouth stretched into a grotesque grin. The figure raised an arm, its fingers contorting as it pointed at her. "Return, the shard," it rasped, its voice layered and inhuman. Lisa stumbled back, her heart hammering in her chest. The room seemed to warp around her, the walls bending and stretching as the figure rose from its chair. The neon sign outside flickered, casting jagged shadows that danced across the walls. Lisa turned to run, but the door was gone. In its place was a black void, pulsating with the same dark energy as the tree. The figure advanced, its distorted grin widening. "Return the shard," it repeated, its voice echoing in her mind. Lisa backed away, her eyes darting around the room for an escape. Her gaze landed on a mirror hanging on the wall. Her reflection stared back at her, but it wasn't her. The reflection's eyes glowed brighter, and its lips curled into a malicious smile. "Give it back," the reflection said, its voice overlapping with the whispers. Lisa clutched her chest, a cold realization washing over her. The shard wasn't something she could return. It was inside her, a part of her now. The whispers grew deafening, the room spinning as the walls closed in. The figure reached for her, its fingers inches from her face. The last thing Lisa saw before the world dissolved into darkness was her own reflection. Grinning as it whispered, "You belong to us now." The void consumed her, but Lisa didn't die. She awoke somewhere else, if the wake was the right term. The sensation was disorienting, as though she'd been pulled through a sieve and reassembled imperfectly. She was standing in an expansive landscape, lit by a blood-red sky that churned with liquid movement, like veins pumping ink. The ground beneath her feet felt unsteady, squirming as though it were alive. Distant, jagged spires loomed in every direction, their tips piercing the unnatural sky. A hollow, aching noise emanated from those spires, like a chorus of groans bleeding into the atmosphere. The sound made her teeth ache. Lisa staggered forward, her legs weak, and found herself on what resembled a pathway, if it could be called that. The ground here shimmered like cracked glass, reflecting not her own face but shifting images of strangers with wide, terrified eyes. Ahead, a figure emerged, walking with an unnatural gait, limbs moving in sharp, disjointed movements. It wasn't human, or at least not anymore. Its torso was twisted into impossible angles, and its face was blank, no eyes or mouth, just smooth, stretched skin. It stopped, its head tilting toward her, sensing. She froze, her breath hitching. Her body screamed for her to run, but something deeper, the same thing that had taken root in her chest, kept her in place. The figure raised an arm, its hand outstretched toward her. From its palm, thin tendrils of shadow began to snake toward her. They moved like they were alive, whispering incoherent phrases as they drew closer. Lisa stumbled back, finally snapping out of her paralysis, but the path behind her was gone. The glassy surface now reflected only her, but not as she was. Her reflection was twisted, her skin pale and stretched, her eyes black voids. The tendrils lashed forward and wrapped around her arm. Pain. Not physical, but something deeper, as though her memories were being siphoned away. She tried to scream, but her voice came out hollow, lost in the oppressive air. Return what you took. The voice wasn't hers. It echoed from inside her head, layered with so many tones it felt like a roar. I didn't take anything, she gasped, but her words felt meaningless. The entity didn't care. More tendrils reached for her, coiling around her torso and lifting her from the ground. She thrashed against them, but the harder she fought, the tighter they squeezed. Return it, the voice repeated, and this time she saw the source. Above the spires, the sky opened like a gaping wound. Something emerged, a shape that defied comprehension. It was vast, so large it seemed to press against the edges of her mind, threatening to tear it apart. Its surface writhed with countless eyes, mouths, and limbs, each one moving independently. Her vision blurred, her consciousness fraying under the weight of the entity's presence. Then, a sudden, sharp sound cut through the chaos, a bell. It was faint but clear, its resonance vibrating through her very core. The tendrils recoiled, and she fell, landing hard on the pulsating ground. She struggled to her knees, gasping, and looked toward the sound. Far in the distance, a small structure stood, a decrepit chapel, its steeple bent and broken. The bell tolled again, louder this time, and the tendrils writhed, retreating further. Lisa didn't think. She ran. The ground shifted beneath her, pulling at her feet, but she didn't stop. The chapel seemed impossibly far, but the sound of the bell guided her. The whispers faded with each step, replaced by the rhythmic chime. The air grew colder as she approached the chapel, her breath visible in short, desperate gasps. The door hung ajar, creaking with the wind, and she pushed her way inside. The interior was sparse, the walls lined with peeling paint and strange symbols carved into the wood. At the center stood an altar, and behind it, a cloaked figure. The figure turned, revealing a face hidden in shadow. It raised a hand, and the bell stopped. The silence was deafening. You've brought the shard, it said, its voice neutral, calm, but layered with something ancient and powerful. Lisa clutched her chest, backing away. I didn't bring anything. I don't even know what this is. The figure stepped closer, its presence suffocating. The shard was taken. Cannot remain within you. It will destroy you, and then it will destroy everything else. I didn't take it. Lisa's voice cracked, tears streaming down her face. You did not take it, the figure agreed. But you hold it now, and it will not let you go. It gestured toward the altar, and Lisa saw it clearly for the first time. A pedestal carved from bone, its surface pulsating with the same dark energy she had felt in the forest. Place your hands upon it, the figure commanded. Lisa hesitated, but the whispers were returning, louder and angrier. The walls of the chapel began to shudder, cracks forming in the wood. The entity in the sky was closing in, its massive form blotting out the crimson light. You have no choice, the figure said. Lisa hesitated, her heart pounding against her ribs. Her hands trembled as she stepped toward the altar, drawn by an invisible force. The figure watched silently, its shadowed presence as immovable as the spires outside. The whispers grew louder, crashing against her mind like tidal waves. The air itself seemed to ripple, carrying with it a sense of urgency. Whatever was coming, it was moments away, and the figure at the altar offered the only reprieve, however sinister. Place your hands, it repeated, though the words no longer came from its mouth. They echoed inside her head, a command laced with inevitability. Lisa's fingers brushed the surface of the bone pedestal, and the moment they made contact, a searing pain shot through her body. She screamed, her voice ripping through the oppressive silence of the chapel. The shard revealed itself. From her chest erupted a faint, crystalline glow, a piece of something ancient and broken. It shimmered with an iridescent hue, pulsating with a rhythm that matched her heartbeat. She felt the weight of its power, its presence so immense that it threatened to consume her entirely. The figure reached out, its long skeletal fingers stretching toward the shard. But the moment it touched the light, the chapel exploded in sound and fury. The walls shattered outward, splinters flying into the void. The spires outside quaked, collapsing into the pulsating ground. Above them, the entity in the sky shrieked, a sound that tore through reality itself. Lisa fell to her knees, clutching the shard as if it were her lifeline. The cloaked figure loomed over her, its calm demeanor unbroken even as the world crumbled. "It cannot stay," it said. "The shard belongs to the beyond." Lisa shook her head violently. "No, if I let it go, I'll die." "You were dead the moment you touched it," the figure replied. The entity's massive form descended, its countless eyes fixated on the shard. Its limbs extended, reaching toward the chapel's remains. The whispers became a deafening roar, a cacophony of voices demanding, pleading, threatening. Lisa scrambled backward, her mind racing. If she gave up the shard, would the figure truly let her go? Would the entity stop, or would its wrath spill into the world she'd left behind? "Choose," the figure said, but the choice wasn't hers to make. The shard flared brightly, its light swallowing everything around her. Lisa screamed again, the sound lost in the blinding brilliance. The entity roared, its massive form halting in mid-descent. The light carved through its limbs, severing parts of it that evaporated into smoke. And then silence. Lisa found herself standing on the same road where it had all begun, the forest still and quiet under a pale moonlight. Her hands were empty. The shard was gone. She turned, expecting to see the cloaked figure or the monstrous entity, but there was nothing. Only the endless stretch of the road, winding into darkness. Yet something lingered. A faint scar burned on her chest, and with it a whisper, a voice faint but familiar. "It's not over." The road ahead shimmered unnaturally, the asphalt rippling like disturbed water. She took a tentative step forward, her legs unsteady but driven by a force she couldn't explain. The road stretched endlessly into the night, and Lisa realized with a sinking dread that she might never leave it. The letter arrived on a damp Tuesday morning, its edges worn and the paper stiff from age. Jack hadn't expected anything unusual to break the monotony of his life, but when he saw the envelope, something inside him stirred. It wasn't the fact that it was addressed to him. It was the handwriting, neat but unfamiliar, that caught his attention. The return address was blank. He hadn't received anything like it in years. He sat down at the kitchen table, unfolding the letter slowly. The paper smelled of mildew, a faint reminder of the dampness that clung to the world outside. His eyes scanned the words, each one drawing him deeper into something he couldn't yet grasp. "You are invited to a place beyond your understanding. Come to the house at the edge of the world. It has waited for you." Jack read the lines twice. His first instinct was to dismiss it. Prank, perhaps. He had no enemies to speak of, but he had heard strange rumors in town over the years. Stories about people receiving letters like this, letters that called them to places they couldn't explain. But none of those rumors were ever real. They were just stories people told when they were bored or afraid. But this letter felt different. The words seemed to pulse with an energy that made his stomach twist. He had heard of the house, vague mentions, fleeting references in local folklore, whispers about a place that existed on the very edge of reality, where time and space blurred into something else entirely. But none of it made sense. It was absurd. Still, as he sat there, the letter in his hands, he felt a tug at his chest. Something compelled him to go. He had no idea what he was about to walk into, but it didn't matter. He couldn't resist. The idea of going to that house to see it for himself was now all he could think about. Jack had lived in a small town for most of his life. Quiet, isolated, with few things to break the monotony. He worked as a mechanic at the local garage, fixing cars that passed through, mostly from tourists who found their way to the nearby mountain range. It was the kind of town that people didn't visit unless they were lost, and most days he was content with that. The routine was comfortable, safe. But now, as he sat in his small apartment, he realized he wasn't happy. He hadn't been happy for years. He hadn't realized how empty his life had become until the letter arrived. Now it was as if something inside him had awakened. A long-buried curiosity, a need to escape the prison he'd built around himself. So he made his decision. The following day, he went to the train station without much thought, bought a one-way ticket with no real destination in mind. The letter hadn't given him much to go on, just the cryptic invitation. The house at the edge of the world. It wasn't a place marked on any map, nor did he have a name or a person to guide him there. It was as if the letter had pulled him into something much larger than himself, something he couldn't escape. The train ride was long, and the further he traveled, the more unsettled he became. The land outside the window grew unfamiliar, the terrain dark and desolate. The usual hum of the city faded into a strange, eerie silence. It was as if the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being drawn deeper into some kind of trap, but the letter, the house, kept him going. After hours of travel, the train finally stopped at a small station in the middle of nowhere. The platform was deserted, and the air smelled of wet earth and decay. Jack stepped off the train, his boots crunching against the gravel. The world around him was still. The trees nearby looked twisted, their limbs reaching out like dark fingers, clawing at the sky. A sign above the platform read Edgewood. Jack had never heard of it. There was nothing here. No welcoming faces, no bustling streets, only an empty road stretching into the fog. And there, at the end of the road, looming like a specter, was a mansion. It was old, its stones weathered and cracked, but it stood tall and imposing. The house at the edge of the world. He could feel it in his bones now, the weight of it pressing on him, pulling him toward it. He had no choice but to walk toward it. The air grew colder with every step he took. The trees seemed to close in around him, and the fog thickened, swallowing the world whole. He couldn't see anything except the faint outline of the mansion ahead, its silhouette barely visible through the mist. When he reached the gates, they creaked open of their own accord, as if they had been waiting for him. He didn't hesitate. He stepped inside. The moment he crossed the threshold, a strange stillness settled over the place. No birds sang, no wind blew. There was only the eerie silence and the scent of decay in the air. The house was grand, its walls adorned with portraits of long-forgotten faces, their eyes seeming to follow him as he walked deeper into the entry hall. The floors creaked beneath his feet, and the house groaned with age, as though it were alive. He felt it then, the weight of history pressing down on him. The house had waited for him, just as the letter said. But why? And for what? A voice echoed through the halls. It was soft, a whisper at first, but it grew louder with each passing moment. It wasn't coming from any one place, but from all around him. It beckoned him, promising something, but Jack couldn't understand what it was saying. As he moved deeper into the house, the walls seemed to shift. The air grew heavier, colder. The floor beneath his feet seemed to buckle, and the portraits on the walls twisted into grotesque, distorted shapes, their eyes bulging, mouths open in silent screams. He had reached the heart of the house. The voice now spoke clearly, its words chilling him to the core. "You've come for something, Jack, but you will never leave. Not the same. You'll never leave at all." A door opened at the end of the hallway, and Jack, trembling, stepped toward it. He knew, without a doubt, that whatever was behind that door would change everything. Jack's heart pounded in his chest as he approached the door, his mind torn between the pull of the unknown and the instinct to turn back, to flee, to forget everything that had led him here. But he couldn't stop now. Something deep within him, something primal, urged him forward. The air felt thicker, as if the house itself was drawing breath, waiting, watching. He pushed the door open, its hinges screeching in protest. The room beyond was dimly lit by a single chandelier, its crystals flickering with a pale, unnatural glow. The furniture was ancient, draped in layers of dust and cobwebs, yet everything seemed perfectly intact, as if untouched by time. The walls were lined with shelves, filled with strange artifacts. Jars of pickled creatures, faded books with symbols Jack didn't recognize, and mirrors that seemed to reflect things that weren't there. At the center of the room stood a large, ornate chair, its velvet cushions dark with age. In front of it, a figure sat, its features obscured by shadow. The voice that had been echoing throughout the house now emanated from this figure, cold and distant. "Welcome," the figure said, its voice low, smooth, almost comforting, like the whisper of an old friend. "You've come for answers, haven't you, Jack? You've come for the one thing that has eluded you your whole life." Jack's throat tightened. He didn't answer. He couldn't. The words were lodged in his chest, stuck like thorns. The figure shifted in the chair, and Jack felt his eyes drawn to it against his will. As the shadows receded, the figure revealed itself. A woman, or what had once been a woman. Her skin was pale, stretched too tight over her bones, and her eyes gleamed with an otherworldly hunger. She smiled, but it was a smile that didn't belong to a human, a smile that only deepened the sense of wrongness in the room. "You think you are seeking redemption," the woman continued, her voice now tinged with something darker. "But the truth, Jack, is far more complicated than that. Redemption is a lie. It's nothing but a comforting illusion, a reason to keep breathing when you know deep down that you are already damned." Jack's pulse raced as her words sank into him. He hadn't realized how badly he had wanted to believe in redemption until now. He hadn't realized how much he had needed it. But now, here in this twisted place, the idea of redemption seemed like nothing more than a cruel joke. "Who are you?" Jack finally managed to ask, his voice hoarse. He wasn't sure if he wanted an answer, or if he was just trying to delay the inevitable. The woman's lips curled upward, her smile widening until it seemed too wide for her face, too unnatural. "I am the one who sees," she said softly. "The one who knows everything you've done, everything you've hidden. The one who can give you what you want most, if you're willing to pay the price." The room seemed to pulse with energy as her words resonated in the air. Jack's mind raced. What did she mean by pay the price? What kind of bargain was she offering? "You want to know why you're here, don't you?" the woman asked, her eyes gleaming with an unsettling understanding. "You've spent years running from your past, hiding from the things you've done. You thought you could outrun it, but you can't, Jack. You can't outrun the darkness inside you." Jack's breath caught in his throat. The memories, those dark, twisted memories of his past, flashed in front of his eyes. He could see them clearly now, the faces of the people he had hurt, the ones he had betrayed, the ones whose lives he had ruined. The guilt, the shame, the endless weight of it all. It had always been with him, lurking just below the surface, gnawing at him. "Let me show you," the woman said, her voice soft but insistent. "Let me show you what you've been running from." The room seemed to darken as her words took root, and Jack felt his body go rigid. He couldn't move. He couldn't speak. His mind was gripped by a force he couldn't understand, a force that dragged him into the shadows of his past. The first memory hit him like a wave, sharp, brutal. He was standing in a dark alleyway, watching as a man, bloodied and bruised, begged for his life. Jack had been the one to do it, the one to put the man in that position. He remembered the rush, the power, the feeling of control. But now, looking back, it felt like a nightmare. His hands were stained with blood, and the faces of the people he had hurt seemed to close in on him, suffocating him. The next memory was worse. He was in a small, dimly lit room, the walls closing in around him. He could hear the pleading voices, feel the fear in the air, the way it clung to everything. He had been the cause of it all, the lies, the betrayal. He had promised to help, to protect, but in the end, he had only made it worse. The woman's laughter echoed in his ears, cruel and knowing. She reveled in his torment, in his suffering. She knew every mistake, every failure. She had seen it all. "Do you understand now, Jack?" she whispered. "Do you understand why you're here? Why you've always been drawn to this place?" Jack couldn't speak. He couldn't even think. The weight of his past, of all the choices he had made, crushed him. The memories were too much to bear. He wanted to scream, to escape, but there was no way out. The house had him, and it would never let him go. "You can make it stop, Jack," the woman said. "You can end it all. All you have to do is make a choice." Her words echoed in the chamber, like a promise and a curse. Jack didn't know what she meant, but he felt the urgency in her voice. He didn't know what kind of power she held, but he knew that whatever it was, it could give him what he wanted most: relief, redemption, freedom from the burden of his past. But at what cost? The woman leaned forward, her smile widening. "Do you want to escape, Jack? Do you want to forget all the pain, all the mistakes? Or are you willing to face it? Are you willing to accept who you really are?" Jack's head spun. He could feel the darkness closing in around him, the weight of his past pressing down on his chest. He was suffocating. "You have a choice, Jack," the woman said again, her voice sweet as honey. "But remember, every choice comes with a price. And once you make it, there is no turning back." Jack was on the verge of collapse. He felt his legs giving way beneath him, the weight of his decisions too much to bear. He could hear the voices in his head, the voices of the people he had wronged, the voices of his own conscience. The room seemed to spin, the walls closing in on him. And then he made his choice. Jack's breath came in ragged gasps, his mind a whirlwind of confusion and fear. His hands trembled as they gripped the edges of the chair. The woman's eyes never left him, their cold gaze like a magnet, pulling him deeper into the web she had woven. "You've made your choice, haven't you?" she asked, her voice like velvet, smooth and manipulative. There was no sympathy, no understanding, just the sharp edge of inevitability. "You want to escape. You want the pain to end." He nodded, barely able to speak. The weight of the memories, the ghosts of all that he had done, pressed down on him with unbearable force. His past had been a twisted trail of lies and cruelty, and every step forward had been built on the suffering of others. But now there was a chance to be free, a chance to sever the ties that bound him to his failures. "Very well," the woman said, standing up slowly, the darkness in the room swirling around her like an inky mist. She extended a hand, pale and long-fingered, towards him. "Take my hand, Jack, and all that you wish for will be yours." There was a moment of hesitation. The air seemed to thicken, suffocating, as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for him to act. Jack could feel the pull of the woman's power, the allure of her offer. It was everything he had ever wanted, the release from the torment, the end of his endless self-loathing. But a flicker of doubt stirred deep within him, just below the surface. Was this truly a chance at redemption? Or was it another trap, another false promise luring him deeper into darkness? He glanced at the door, the faintest thought of escape crossing his mind. But the door was now sealed tight, the hallway outside nothing but shadows. There was no way back. I want it," Jack whispered, his voice thick with desperation. His hand shook as he reached out, brushing against hers. The instant his skin made contact with hers, the room seemed to collapse in on itself. A cold, numbing wave washed over him, as if the very essence of life had been drained from the air. His vision blurred, and he felt his body grow heavier, as if his soul itself was being sucked out of him, leaving only a hollow shell. The woman's grin widened, impossibly wide, stretching across her face, revealing sharp, jagged teeth. Her eyes, once gleaming with power, now looked like empty voids, devoid of all humanity. "Did you really think it would be that easy?" she purred. "Did you think you could escape your past with a simple wish?" The room spun wildly as Jack's heart began to race, his breath shallow and frantic. He tried to pull away, but it was too late. The woman's grip tightened around him, her fingers cold like iron. The shadows in the room seemed to twist, forming grotesque shapes, reaching out for him. "I offered you escape, Jack," she whispered, her voice no longer sweet but venomous. "But you are not the one to make the choice. You never were." He struggled, his body fighting against an invisible force that held him in place. His mind screamed for release, for an end to the agony. The shadows around him grew thicker, darker, until they consumed everything. The last vestiges of light flickered and died. When Jack awoke, he was lying on the floor of the room, the chair gone, the woman nowhere to be seen. The room was quiet, almost too quiet. His head throbbed as he tried to sit up, his muscles aching as if he had been contorted in unnatural positions for hours. The silence was oppressive. The air was thick with the smell of dampness and decay. Jack's heart pounded as he slowly pushed himself to his feet, his legs unsteady beneath him. Something had changed. Something was wrong. He turned, his eyes scanning the room. Everything was the same, and yet nothing was. The walls, the shelves, the mirrors, all seemed to pulsate with a strange, unsettling energy. The room itself felt alive, as if it were aware of his presence, watching him with malevolent intent. A low, guttural sound echoed from the corner of the room. Jack's eyes shot towards it, his breath catching in his throat. There, emerging from the darkness, were figures, shadows, but not shadows. They were vaguely human, their features twisted, distorted. Their eyes glowed with a sickly green light, and their mouths opened wide, revealing rows of jagged teeth. Jack stumbled backward, panic flooding his veins. He had seen them before, in his dreams, in his nightmares. These were the faces of the people he had wronged, the ones he had hurt. They were here, and they were angry. "No," he whispered, shaking his head. "No, this can't be happening." But the figures advanced, their limbs moving in jerky, unnatural motions, their eyes never leaving him. He could feel their presence closing in on him, suffocating him. "Jack," one of them hissed, its voice raspy and distorted, like a broken record. "You wanted escape, didn't you? You wanted redemption." Jack's breath caught in his throat as the realization hit him like a punch to the gut. This was his price. This was what he had paid for his wish. He hadn't escaped his past. He had only deepened his torment. The figures surrounded him, their grotesque faces contorted in expressions of rage and pain. They reached out for him, their hands cold and clammy, their touch like ice. "You can never escape what you've done, Jack," another figure croaked. "You can never outrun the darkness inside you." Jack tried to run, but his legs felt like lead. He stumbled, his feet tripping over each other as he tried to make it to the door. But the door was gone. The room was a prison, and he was trapped inside it, with the ghosts of his past closing in. The figures closed in on him, their whispers growing louder, filling his mind with their accusations. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. All that remained was the suffocating darkness, the relentless weight of his guilt, and the gnawing feeling that he had made the wrong choice. And then, just as he felt the cold hands close around his throat, the darkness swallowed him whole. The blackness that consumed Jack was suffocating, like drowning in a void that knew no end. There was no sound, no light, no escape, just endless, crushing pressure. For a moment, he thought he had died. But death, he quickly realized, was not what awaited him. His body felt weightless, as though he were drifting in some sort of dark limbo. Time had no meaning here. His thoughts swirled, fragmented and broken, torn apart by the haunting voices of those he had wronged, their accusations replaying in his mind like a cruel, endless loop. Each face, each name, flashed before him with unrelenting speed, their hatred and pain directed squarely at him. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the darkness lifted. Jack gasped, his lungs aching as he inhaled the musty air. His eyes snapped open, only to be met with an oppressive, gray sky overhead. He was no longer in the room. He was standing in the middle of a barren, windswept field, the ground beneath his feet cracked and dry. The land stretched out in every direction, devoid of life, its emptiness mirroring the hollow ache in his chest. The figures, the shadows were gone, but the weight of their presence lingered, a constant, gnawing reminder of what he had done. Jack's hands clenched into fists at his sides, his nails digging into the skin of his palms. His heart pounded in his chest, but there was no relief. Only the crushing reality that this, whatever this was his new existence. As he looked around, trying to make sense of his surroundings, he saw something in the distance. An old, decaying building. It stood alone, broken and abandoned, a haunting silhouette against the oppressive sky. It was familiar, somehow, though Jack couldn't place why. Without thinking, he began to walk toward it. His legs moved mechanically, each step heavier than the last, as though the land itself resisted his movement. His thoughts were clouded, his mind still reeling from the events that had brought him here. What had happened? Had he truly made a deal with the devil, or was this just another layer of his punishment? As he approached the building, its details became clearer. It was an old house, long abandoned, its windows shattered, its door hanging off its hinges. The walls were covered in thick layers of grime and soot, the roof caving in at odd angles. It was a place of death, of decay. And yet, there was something familiar about it, something that felt like home. Jack hesitated at the threshold, his hand hovering over the door, his gut twisted with a deep, instinctual dread. He knew what he would find inside, or at least he thought he did. With a deep breath, he pushed the door open, its rusty hinges creaking in protest. The inside of the house was dark, the air thick with dust and decay. The walls seemed to close in on him, as though the house was alive, watching him, judging him. But it was the shadows that filled the room, shifting and writhing in unnatural ways, that truly made his blood run cold. Suddenly, a voice, low and guttural, whispered from the corner of the room. Jack spun around, his heart skipping a beat. "You should never have come back." The words sent a shock of fear through his body, but he could not tear his eyes away from the source of the voice. There, in the far corner of the room, stood a figure. It was cloaked in darkness, its face hidden in the shadows, but Jack could feel its presence, its power. It was the same voice that had spoken to him in the house, the same voice that had manipulated him into making the choice that had led him here. "You thought you could escape," the voice continued, its tone mocking, cruel. "You thought you could outrun the consequences of your actions. But you cannot. You cannot hide from yourself." Jack's heart raced, his mind a mess of conflicting emotions. He wanted to run, to escape, but he knew he couldn't. Not now. Not anymore. He had made his choice, and now he would face the consequences. "You wanted redemption," the voice said, its form beginning to shift, like smoke swirling in the air. "But you've only found more suffering, more torment. This is your fate, Jack, your punishment, and there is no escaping it." Jack opened his mouth to speak, to beg, to plead for mercy, but no words came out. His throat was dry, his voice stolen by the weight of the darkness around him. The figure in the corner stepped forward, its face emerging from the shadows. It was a twisted, horrific version of himself, a reflection of all the guilt, all the darkness that had festered inside him. Its eyes were empty, hollow, just like the ones he had seen in his nightmares. Its lips curled into a sinister smile, and it whispered, "You will never be free." Jack fell to his knees, the weight of the truth crashing down on him. There was no escape, no redemption, no hope. His past, his choices had bound him to this place, and he would never be able to outrun the consequences. The torment would never end. As the figure stepped closer, Jack felt the darkness consume him once again, his vision fading to black. The darkness that swallowed Jack felt heavier this time, as if the weight of the void was pressing him deeper into its grasp. But this time he wasn't floating aimlessly. He could feel the ground beneath him, cold, damp, and unforgiving stone. Slowly, awareness returned to him. His body ached, his head throbbed, and the sharp metallic scent of blood hung in the air. When he opened his eyes, Jack found himself in what looked like an ancient, decrepit hall. The walls were made of cracked stone, slick with moss and grime, and faint, otherworldly light flickered from torches mounted along the walls. The air was suffused with a chilling dampness, and the oppressive silence was broken only by the distant sound of dripping water. Ahead of him, a massive set of double doors loomed, carved from blackened wood and adorned with grotesque, swirling patterns that seemed to writhe when he looked too closely. They exuded a malevolent aura, as though whatever lay beyond was alive and waiting. "Jack," a voice hissed, echoing around the hall. He turned sharply, searching for the source, but there was nothing, only shadows that seemed to stretch and pulse unnaturally. The voice came again, this time from everywhere and nowhere. "You thought you could escape me." The voice sent shivers down his spine, but it was familiar, hauntingly so. It was his own voice, twisted and layered, as if spoken by something imitating him. "Come," it urged. "You're almost there." Against his better judgment, Jack found himself stepping forward. Each step felt like an eternity, his footsteps echoing loudly against the silence of the hall. His heartbeat thundered in his ears, and the closer he got to the doors, the heavier the air became. When he reached them, he hesitated. The carvings seemed to shift under his gaze, forming grotesque faces contorted in agony. One of them whispered, "Turn back." Another hissed, "It's too late." Ignoring them, Jack pushed against the doors, his hands trembling as the heavy wood groaned open. The space beyond was immense, a cavernous chamber that stretched infinitely in every direction, its ceiling lost in darkness. At its center was a massive, pulsating mass of shadow, a void given form. Tendrils of darkness extended from it, twisting and curling like smoke, and its surface shimmered with an otherworldly iridescence. Jack felt a pull, a magnetic force that drew him closer. The mass seemed alive, breathing, pulsating in rhythm with his own heartbeat. As he stepped into the chamber, the doors behind him slammed shut with a deafening boom. "Welcome," the shadow hissed. Its voice was layered, like 1,000 whispers speaking at once. "You've come far, Jack." Jack swallowed hard, his mouth dry. "What are you?" The shadow pulsed, and for a moment, Jack saw his own face reflected in its surface, distorted and twisted. "I am everything you fear, everything you desire. I am the consequences of your choices, Jack. And I am the one who holds the answers you seek." "You're the one who brought me here," Jack said, his voice trembling. "You're the one who showed me all of this." "I showed you the truth," the shadow corrected. "The truth of who you are, of what you are. And now you must decide." "Decide what?" Jack asked, his fists clenched. "What do you want from me?" The shadow's tendrils extended, encircling him but never touching. "Your fate is in your hands, Jack. You came seeking redemption, but redemption has a price." A tendril of darkness snaked toward him, stopping inches from his chest. From its tip emerged a small, black dagger, its blade glinting with a sinister light. "Take this," the shadow said. "Use it. Sacrifice the part of yourself that holds you back, the part that clings to guilt, to weakness. Only then can you be free." Jack stared at the dagger, his heart pounding. It seemed to radiate power, calling to him. But the voice of the shadow wasn't the only one he heard. Echoes of the people he had wronged whispered in his ears, their voices filled with pain and anger. "You think freedom comes from running away?" one voice hissed. "You think a clean slate erases what you've done? You don't deserve freedom," another spat. "You deserve this. All of this." Jack's hand hovered over the dagger. His mind raced. If he took it, if he used it, would he truly find peace? Or would he simply be trading one torment for another? The shadow seemed to sense his hesitation. "You cannot escape your past, Jack," it said, its voice soothing, almost comforting. "But you can control your future. Take the dagger. Free yourself." Jack's fingers closed around the hilt of the blade. It was cold, its surface slick and unyielding. As he lifted it, the voices in his head grew louder, a cacophony of pain and anger and regret. The weight of the dagger was immense, as though it carried the burden of every choice he had ever made. The shadow loomed closer, its form shifting and pulsing. "Make your choice, Jack. Sacrifice your guilt, or remain a prisoner of it forever." Jack raised the blade, his hand trembling. The chamber seemed to close in around him, the air thick with tension. His mind was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions: fear, anger, regret, and a desperate longing for peace. And then he made his choice. The dagger in Jack's hand seemed to hum, as if alive, its dark energy pulsing in time with his own heartbeat. He held it aloft, the point hovering just above his chest, where the shadow tendrils now coiled loosely, waiting, watching. The voices of the people he had wronged grew deafening, filling his mind with chaos, doubt, and recrimination. "It's all a lie," one of the voices snarled. "This shadow offers nothing but more chains." "No," another countered, pleading. "This is your chance, Jack. Don't waste it." The conflicting whispers clawed at his thoughts, driving him closer to the edge of madness. The shadow loomed closer, its tendrils forming a semicircle around him, hemming him in. Each movement it made seemed calculated, as though it were savoring the moment. "Do it," it urged, its voice honeyed with temptation. "Release the burden you carry, and you will find the strength to rise above it." Jack's grip tightened around the dagger. His arm trembled. Could he do it? Could he sever the part of himself that held all the pain, all the guilt, all the humanity he had left? Was that sacrifice worth whatever peace the shadow promised? In the chamber's oppressive silence, another voice rose above the clamor. Faint, but clear and resolute. It was his own voice, untainted and raw. "This isn't about freedom," it whispered. "This is about power. And power always demands more." Jack froze. The realization hit him like a thunderclap. The shadow didn't want to free him, it wanted to feed on him. The sacrifice wasn't about redemption or letting go of guilt. It was about submission, about surrendering the last shred of control he had over his life. He turned to face the shadow, lowering the dagger slowly. Its surface darkened, the shimmer dimming as if sensing his defiance. "No," Jack said, his voice barely above a whisper, but firm. The shadow recoiled slightly, the tendrils quivering. "What did you say?" "I said no," Jack repeated, louder this time. "I'm not giving you what you want." The chamber seemed to shudder, the walls vibrating with a low, guttural growl. The shadow's form expanded, towering over him, its tendrils writhing angrily. "Foolish mortal," it hissed, the honeyed tone replaced by raw malice. "Do you think you can defy me? You came here seeking my power. You think you can leave without paying the price?" Jack gritted his teeth, his resolve hardening. "Maybe I can't leave, but I'm not giving you the satisfaction." With that, he hurled the dagger to the ground. The blade shattered on impact, releasing a burst of dark energy that rippled through the chamber. The shadow screamed, a sound that pierced through Jack's very soul, and the tendrils lashed out wildly, striking the walls and ceiling. Cracks spiderwebbed through the stone, chunks of debris raining down. The oppressive weight in the air lifted slightly, and for a moment Jack thought he might have gained the upper hand. But then the shadow coiled in on itself, its form condensing into a smaller, more concentrated mass. Its voice was quieter now, but sharper, more menacing. "You will regret this, Jack," it said. "You think you've won, but you've only sealed your fate. I am not bound by this place. Wherever you go, I will follow. Whatever you do, I will haunt you. There is no escape." The ground beneath Jack's feet began to crumble, and he stumbled backward, barely keeping his balance. The shadow surged forward, a wave of darkness that engulfed him. He felt its cold tendrils wrap around his body, squeezing, pulling, dragging him into the void. And then he was falling. When Jack opened his eyes, he was lying on the forest floor, the canopy of twisted, skeletal trees above him blotting out the sky. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and the faint sounds of the forest, rustling leaves, distant animal cries, felt unnaturally muted. He pushed himself to his feet, every muscle in his body aching. The memory of the shadow's voice lingered in his mind, a persistent echo that refused to fade. "You think you can escape me?" it had said. "There is no escape." Jack glanced around, trying to get his bearings. The forest seemed endless, its paths winding and indistinguishable. But as he turned, he saw something that made his blood run cold. Carved into the bark of a nearby tree were the same grotesque symbols that had adorned the shadow's doors. They glowed faintly, pulsing with a sinister light. And they weren't just on one tree, they were everywhere, forming a network of eerie markings that spread as far as he could see. The shadow was right. It wasn't bound by the chamber. It was here in the forest, in the very air he breathed. And it was watching. Jack stumbled forward, his breath quickening. The faint glow of the symbols on the trees pulsed rhythmically, almost like a heartbeat. Alive, watching, mocking. Every step he took was shadowed by the sense of something unseen just behind him. Yet no matter how quickly he turned, there was nothing but darkness and the tangled forest. He could feel the shadow's presence, a chilling weight on his chest that seemed to deepen with each passing moment. It wasn't a question of if it would strike, but when. After what felt like hours of wandering, Jack emerged into a clearing. The oppressive trees gave way to an open expanse dominated by an ancient, crumbling structure. It looked like a church or what was left of one. The spire had long since fallen, and the walls were choked with creeping vines, their leaves black and glossy like spilled ink. The air here felt heavier, laden with an unnatural silence. Jack hesitated. His instincts screamed to turn back, but the glimmer of torchlight from within the ruined structure drew him in. Someone or something was inside. He wasn't alone. With each step toward the church, his surroundings seemed to warp. The forest grew darker, the trees closing in like silent sentinels. The air carried whispers now, soft, unintelligible, but insistent. His hand twitched toward his belt, where his knife sat, a meager comfort against whatever lay ahead. Inside the church, the torchlight flickered erratically, casting jagged shadows across the walls. As Jack approached the entrance, he saw the source of the light, a group of figures in dark robes standing in a circle. They chanted in low, guttural tones, their voices blending with the whispers that had plagued him in the forest. In the center of the circle lay a woman, bound and gagged, her eyes wide with terror. Symbols, identical to those on the trees, were carved into her bare arms, blood trickling down her skin. She writhed against her bonds, but the ropes held firm. Jack's chest tightened. He had seen his share of horrors in the world, but this was something else entirely. The robed figures didn't notice him, their focus consumed by their ritual. Jack crouched behind a broken pew, weighing his options. He could intervene, but against how many? 6? 7? He wasn't sure. And if they had the same connection to the shadow as the forest symbols did, he might be walking into a trap. But the woman's muffled screams pulled at him. He couldn't just leave her. Could he? A tendril of the shadow's voice slid into his mind. She's already lost. You'll accomplish nothing but your own destruction. Walk away. Jack shook his head, trying to block out the voice, but it persisted. They will kill you, Jack. They will make you suffer. For what? One life? How many have you already abandoned? One more makes no difference. His fingers brushed the hilt of his knife. He could almost hear his pulse thudding in his ears. He took a slow, deep breath, and then he moved. Jack sprang from his hiding place, his knife flashing in the dim torchlight. The first robed figure didn't even have time to scream before Jack's blade slit their throat. Blood sprayed across the stone floor, and the chanting stopped abruptly. The others turned, their faces hidden by deep hoods. One raised a hand, and Jack felt a wave of force slam into him, throwing him against the wall. Pain exploded through his back, and he barely managed to roll away as a second figure lunged at him with a rusted blade. Adrenaline surged, dulling the pain. Jack lashed out, catching the second attacker's wrist and driving his knife into their ribs. The figure let out a gurgling gasp before collapsing. The others moved quickly, their movements inhumanly fluid. Jack's mind raced. He was outnumbered and outmatched. The shadow's voice slithered back into his thoughts. Run, Jack. Leave her. Save yourself. No, he shouted, his voice echoing off the walls. He ducked under another attack, his knife slicing through the fabric of a robe. He could see the woman now, her eyes locked on his, silently begging him to hurry. A robed figure began chanting again, and Jack felt the air grow thick. Shadows coalesced around the figure's hands, forming sharp, jagged shapes. Jack threw his knife, the blade spinning end over end before sinking into the figure's chest. The shadows dissipated, and the figure crumpled. By the time the fight ended, Jack was bloodied and gasping for breath. The robed figures lay dead around him, their bodies unnaturally still, as though life had been drained from them entirely. Jack staggered to the woman and cut her bonds. She sat up, coughing and rubbing her wrists, her eyes darting to the bodies around them. Who are you?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Someone who doesn't have time for questions," Jack said, pulling her to her feet. "We need to." The floor beneath them shuddered, and a low growl reverberated through the church. Jack turned to see the bodies of the robed figures dissolving into dark, viscous liquid. The liquid pooled together, bubbling and churning, forming a massive, writhing mass of shadow. The shadow's voice boomed, filling the chamber. "You cannot fight me, Jack. You cannot win. You only delay the inevitable." Jack gripped the woman's arm tightly, pulling her toward the exit. "Move," he shouted. They ran, the shadow surging after them, its tendrils slithering across the floor and walls, tearing through the stone like paper. Jack and the woman burst from the crumbling church into the oppressive forest. The shadow surged behind them, its tendrils tearing through trees, reducing them to splinters. The symbols on the trees pulsed brighter, their glow casting eerie patterns on the forest floor. The whispers grew louder, a cacophony that seemed to come from the very air around them. They reached a clearing with a massive stone monolith in the center, its surface covered in the same glowing runes. Jack's instincts screamed that this was the source, the anchor that allowed the shadow to exist in the physical world. The woman stumbled to her knees, clutching her arms where the symbols had been carved into her skin. "You brought me here for a reason," she gasped, her voice trembling. "It needs me to finish the ritual, to break free." Jack turned to her, his mind racing. He could see it now, this wasn't about saving her. She was a vessel, a catalyst for whatever the shadow intended to do. The runes on her arms began glowing, resonating with the symbols on the monolith. The shadow reared back, towering over them like a living storm. "Kill her, Jack," the shadow hissed, its voice both seductive and terrifying. "End her life and I will spare you. Walk away. This is not your burden." The woman looked up at him, her eyes wide with terror and pleading. "Don't listen to it," she cried. "If you kill me, it wins. But if you don't..." She didn't finish the sentence. They both knew what her words implied. She would die anyway, but the shadow might remain bound. Jack gritted his teeth. His knife felt impossibly heavy in his hand. Every fiber of his being screamed for a way out, a choice that didn't end in blood or failure. But there was none. The shadow lunged, its tendrils swarming toward Jack and the woman. Jack acted on instinct, shoving her behind him and raising his knife. The blade glinted in the faint light of the runes, and for a moment, the tendrils hesitated. "Stop running," the shadow growled, its voice a thunderous roar. "End her. Save yourself. That is your only escape." Jack's mind flashed with memories of his past. Every death he had caused, every decision that had led him to this moment. The weight of his guilt was suffocating. He had sought redemption, but now he realized there was no clean path to it. "I'm not afraid of you," Jack spat, gripping the knife tightly. The shadow paused, almost as if amused. "You should be." Jack turned to the woman, his voice low and strained. "I need you to run." "No," she cried. "If I leave, it'll..." "Run," Jack bellowed, shoving her toward the edge of the clearing. The woman hesitated, tears streaming down her face, but then she turned and ran. Jack faced the monolith, the runes glowing brighter as the shadow closed in. He knew what he had to do. Jack plunged the knife into the monolith. A deafening crack split the air, and the runes exploded with light. The shadow let out an unearthly scream, its form writhing and twisting as the light consumed it. The tendrils disintegrated, the darkness peeling away layer by layer. But the cost was immediate. The light from the runes surged into Jack, his body convulsing as the monolith drew on his life force. The ground beneath him trembled, the earth splitting open as the shadow was dragged back into the void it had come from. The woman stopped at the edge of the forest, turning to see Jack standing before the monolith, his body engulfed in light. "Jack!" she screamed, her voice breaking. Jack turned to her one last time, his face pale but resolute. "Go." Live, the light intensified, blinding and all-consuming. The woman shielded her eyes as the ground beneath the monolith collapsed, swallowing the structure, Jack, and the shadow in one final, cataclysmic roar. When the light faded, the forest was silent. The monolith was gone, replaced by a smoldering crater. The woman stood at the edge, staring into the void, tears streaming down her face. The oppressive weight of the shadow was gone, but so was Jack. She fell to her knees, clutching the knife he had left behind. The runes on her arms had faded, but their scars remained, a permanent reminder of what had transpired. In the distance, the forest began to regrow, the trees reclaiming the clearing as if nothing had happened. But the woman knew better. The shadow was gone, but the cost of its banishment would haunt her forever. And somewhere, in the deepest recesses of the void, the shadow whispered faintly, its presence not entirely erased. Nothing stays buried forever.
The wind howled through the trees, an eerie sound that echoed through the barren landscape. The once thriving town of Hollow Creek now stood in ruin, its buildings crumbling like the remnants of a forgotten nightmare. The streets, once lined with laughter and life, were silent. A thick fog had settled over the town, obscuring everything within it. The kind of fog that made your skin crawl and your breath feel colder than it should be. In the center of it all, a house stood, unassuming, except for the whispers that had followed it for generations. The Blackthorn House. It was said to be cursed. No one had lived there for decades, but its presence loomed over Hollow Creek like a dark specter. Stories of strange happenings, of people disappearing without a trace, of odd noises in the dead of night. These were the things that kept the townsfolk from venturing near. And yet, there were always those who couldn't resist the pull of curiosity. It was to this house that Michael, an investigative journalist, had come. A man used to chasing the truth, no matter how dark or dangerous it might be. He had heard the stories. He had read the legends. But he wasn't here for the tales or the rumors. No, Michael had a single goal in mind: to uncover the truth behind the Blackthorn House, to prove once and for all that the supernatural could be explained away. The door creaked open as he stepped onto the rotting porch. His flashlight flickered in his hand, the beam casting long shadows across the cracked wooden floor. Every step he took seemed to echo unervingly in the empty space around him. The air was thick, heavy with dust and the scent of decay. His heart raced, though he refused to acknowledge it. Fear was something for the weak, something for those who let their imaginations run wild. He wasn't one of them. He was here for the facts, the truth, nothing more. He pushed the door open further, stepping into the hallway. The house was cold, its atmosphere thick with the oppressive weight of something that had once been alive but now was long dead. The walls, lined with peeling wallpaper, seemed to close in on him as he moved deeper into the house. Every room he passed seemed to whisper to him, voices muffled and indistinct, but undeniably present. Michael reached the staircase. The wooden steps groaned beneath his weight, protesting each step he took. He hesitated for a moment at the top, the darkness above him swallowing his flashlight's beam, but he pushed forward. His mind was set. Nothing would stop him now. At the end of the hallway, a door stood ajar. He approached it cautiously, his breath shallow in his chest. The floor creaked beneath his feet, and the door swung open with a disturbing ease. Inside was a bedroom, its contents covered in dust and cobwebs. The bed was empty, the sheets a faded yellow, but it was the other objects in the room that caught Michael's attention. An old rocking chair sat by the window, its seat gently swaying as if disturbed by an invisible force. A dresser stood against the wall, its drawers slightly ajar, revealing nothing but empty space. And in the corner of the room, facing the wall, stood a tall, thin mirror. It was the only thing in the room that didn't seem to have aged, its surface polished and reflecting the dim light from Michael's flashlight. He approached the mirror, his reflection distorted by the light. As he gazed into it, a strange unease settled in his stomach. There was something off about it, something that didn't belong. Then, without warning, the reflection shifted. Michael's breath caught in his throat. The room behind him seemed to twist and bend, the walls stretching impossibly. In the mirror, a figure emerged from the shadows, its outline blurred and indistinct. It was tall, thin, its movements jerky and unnatural. Michael spun around, heart pounding in his chest, but there was nothing behind him. Only the cold, empty room. The figure in the mirror had vanished. He staggered back, nearly tripping over a loose floorboard. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he tried to calm his breathing. The logical part of his mind screamed at him to leave, that it was all just a trick of the light, his mind playing games on him. But he couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Before he could decide whether to leave or investigate further, a sudden noise echoed from downstairs, a low, guttural sound. Michael froze, his breath catching in his throat. It wasn't human. It wasn't anything he could explain away with logic. The noise grew louder, closer. Slowly, he turned back to the mirror, his gaze drawn to the glass once more. And that's when he saw it. A face, pale, hollow, its eyes dark and empty, pressed against the surface of the mirror. It was smiling, its mouth stretched unnaturally wide, its teeth jagged and sharp. Michael backed away, stumbling toward the door, but as he reached for the handle, the room seemed to close in on him. The walls shifted, the floor tilted beneath his feet, and the air grew thick with an oppressive weight. The mirror's reflection grew darker, the figure becoming more distinct. It stepped out of the mirror, its limbs twisting and contorting, its eyes locked on Michael. And then, just as the figure lunged toward him, the room went black. Michael awoke with a start. His body was cold, his heart hammering in his chest. He was no longer in the room. He was lying on the floor in the hallway, the same hallway he had entered earlier. The house was silent again, but something had changed. The air felt heavier, charged with an unseen presence. And then a voice, a whisper, echoed through the silence. "Welcome home." Michael's blood ran cold. The door slammed shut behind him, and in the darkness he understood. He was never leaving. The room seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. Michael's hands trembled as he reached out to touch the floor, his fingers brushing against the cold, damp wood. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat reverberating in his ears. He could feel the presence closing in, like something was waiting, watching, lurking just beyond his reach. His breath hitched as he slowly pushed himself to his feet, the silence pressing down on him like a vice. The whisper, faint but chilling, had come from nowhere and everywhere at once. It wasn't just a voice, it was a feeling, a sensation that wrapped itself around him like a suffocating fog. "Welcome home." The words replayed in his mind, but the meaning behind them was as elusive as the figure in the mirror. Was it real? Was he truly trapped? Or was his mind starting to unravel, finally succumbing to the dread that had been building ever since he stepped foot into this forsaken house? He glanced around, eyes darting to the empty doorway. The house was dark, save for the dim light from his flashlight. It flickered uncertainly as he took a slow step toward the stairs. He couldn't stay here. Not like this. He had to leave. He had to get out before whatever was here consumed him entirely. The air grew colder as he descended the stairs, his footsteps soft against the rotting wood. The oppressive silence was broken only by the sound of his breathing, shallow and uneven. He reached the bottom of the stairs and hesitated, feeling an unsettling pull toward the front door. But as his hand touched the handle, a sudden, violent force slammed into his chest, throwing him backward onto the floor. The flashlight tumbled from his hand, its beam casting long, distorted shadows across the walls. Before he could react, the darkness seemed to shift around him. The floor beneath him groaned, and a low, guttural growl filled the room. His eyes widened in terror as the shadows along the walls began to take shape, dark, twisted forms that writhed and slithered like insects. Something moved in the corner of his vision, a flicker of motion too fast for him to catch. His breath quickened, panic rising as the shadows stretched and contorted into figures, shifting and twisting into shapes that defied logic. He scrambled to his feet, heart racing, but before he could make it to the door, the shadows lunged forward. A cold, clammy hand grasped his ankle, pulling him back with an unnatural strength. He screamed, desperately trying to free himself, but the grip tightened, pulling him deeper into the darkness. The floor seemed to bend beneath him, the walls warping as though they were alive, closing in on him. His fingers scraped against the wooden planks as he tried to crawl away, but the shadows had already surrounded him. They were everywhere now, undulating shapes with no true form, just endless masses of blackness that pulsated with an almost malevolent energy. "Help me," Michael gasped, his voice barely a whisper as the dark tendrils snaked around him. His chest tightened as though the very air was being sucked out of the room. He could feel the cold seeping into his bones, the weight of the darkness pressing against his body. A voice, low and breathy, echoed from the shadows. It wasn't the same whisper from before. This was deeper, darker, more threatening. "Too late," it hissed. "You've always belonged here." The words sent a shiver down his spine. His mind raced, trying to comprehend what was happening, but nothing made sense. The world around him seemed to be warping, bending under the pressure of something far worse than he could ever imagine. The shadows constricted tighter around him, choking him, suffocating him. He gasped for air, but it was as if the very space he occupied was being drained of life, leaving him helpless in the grip of whatever force had taken hold of the house. Then, as if on cue, the world went still. The pressure on his chest released. The shadows recoiled for a moment, as if waiting. Michael's mind buzzed with confusion. Was it over? Had they let him go? But the silence was unbearable, and his pulse quickened as he realized that the true horror wasn't in the darkness or the shadows themselves. It was in the silence. The complete, soul-crushing silence that now surrounded him. The floorboards creaked beneath his feet once again, but this time, it was not his movement. The sound came from somewhere deeper within the house. His stomach churned with dread, but he couldn't look away. The door, the very one he had tried to escape through, was no longer in front of him. Instead, the walls had shifted, and a narrow hallway stretched out before him, dimly lit by flickering candles. A silhouette stood at the far end of the hallway, a shadow that seemed to shimmer in the dim light. It was motionless, watching him with cold, lifeless eyes. And as Michael's breath caught in his throat, the figure slowly began to move. With each step it took, the air grew colder, heavier. The once silent house was now filled with the echo of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, unforgiving. Michael's legs felt like lead, but he forced himself to take a step forward, determined to face whatever lay ahead. He couldn't back down now. There was no going back. He didn't know what was waiting for him, but he knew one thing for certain. This house would never let him leave. "I don't want it to end yet, so rewrite it again." ChatGPT plus. ChatGPT. The figure's movement was slow, deliberate, its limbs stretching and bending unnaturally, like a shadow made flesh. Michael's heart pounded in his chest, a frantic rhythm that matched the wild thoughts racing through his mind. Each step it took felt like an eternity. It was getting closer, too close, and his instincts screamed at him to run, to flee, but his body refused to obey. The house felt alive, as though the walls themselves were closing in, suffocating him with a pressure he couldn't escape. The air was thick, cold, every breath coming in shallow gasps as Michael tried to steady himself. But the figure, whatever it was the only thing that seemed to matter now. He couldn't look away, couldn't take his eyes off it. As it drew closer, Michael's mind screamed at him to run, to do anything to escape, but his legs felt like they were made of stone, rooted to the floor, unable to move. The temperature continued to drop, the chill biting into his skin, his breath fogging the air in front of him. He was trapped, cornered, and with every second that passed, he could feel his sanity fraying at the edges. The figure moved like liquid, flowing rather than walking, its body an ever-shifting blur of darkness that stretched beyond what was physically possible. The space around it seemed to warp, bend, and twist with every movement, as though reality itself was breaking apart in its wake. Michael's vision was beginning to swim. His mind couldn't focus on anything other than the figure before him. It was close now, standing just a few feet away. He could feel the cold radiating from it, could smell the faint stench of decay, of something rotten and forgotten. And then it stopped. The figure's head tilted slightly, and Michael's stomach churned as he realized that the presence wasn't just physical. It was something else, something ancient, something far older than the house or even the land it stood on. It wasn't just a monster, or a ghost, or a mere hallucination. This was something that had always been there, waiting. The air grew thicker, the silence deafening, and then the whisper came. Low, guttural, like the murmur of 1,000 voices from a time long past. "Do you hear it?" the voice asked, reverberating in his skull. "The walls are always watching. The house is always listening." Michael couldn't respond. His body trembled uncontrollably, his mouth dry, and his throat so tight he could barely breathe. The house, it was alive. It was aware of him. It had been watching him since the moment he stepped through the door. He tried to move, tried to force his limbs to respond, but they wouldn't. His body was frozen in place, his mind spiraling into panic. "I don't understand," he managed to rasp, his voice barely a whisper, lost in the heavy silence. The figure leaned closer, and Michael could feel its presence invading his thoughts, like tendrils of darkness curling around his mind. The space between them closed, and the figure's face, a face that should not have been possible, materialized before him. It was featureless. No eyes, no mouth, just an empty void where a face should have been, an abyss that seemed to pull at his very soul. "You are part of the story now." The voice spoke again, the words seeping into his consciousness like poison. "Once you've entered, you can never leave. The house will never let you go." Michael's mind raced. He remembered the stories, the old rumors about places like this, places where the line between life and death was thin, where the house itself could claim its inhabitants, twisting them into something else. But he hadn't believed them. Not until now. The figure moved again, faster this time, its limbs snapping into place as it closed in on him, its presence suffocating. Michael gasped for air, but it felt like the very atmosphere was being drained away. A sharp, searing pain erupted in his chest. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think, only the overwhelming pressure. The walls were closing in now, the room shrinking, warping. The floor beneath him seemed to twist and distort, like it was no longer solid, like he was standing on the edge of a cliff, about to fall into the unknown. The figure's voice was inside his mind now, swirling around him, overwhelming him. "You are the next part of the cycle," it whispered, its tone cold, clinical, as though this had all been predestined. You will stay here. Forever. Michael's heart raced. He could feel the weight of the house, of the figure, of the ancient presence closing in on him, pressing down on him. The world around him was collapsing and there was no way out. But just as he thought it was all over, the ground beneath him cracked. A deep, resonating sound, like the breaking of stone, filled the room and the walls trembled. Michael's eyes widened as he saw a faint glow, a soft, almost imperceptible light, flickering in the distance, a small beacon in the overwhelming darkness. The figure's head snapped toward the light, and for a brief moment, there was something like hesitation in its movements. It turned back to Michael, its empty face mere inches away from his, the air thick with cold dread. "You think you can escape?" it hissed, its voice low and mocking. "There is no escape. You belong to us now." Michael's pulse quickened as the light grew stronger, brighter, cutting through the suffocating darkness. It wasn't a salvation, but it was something. And that something was enough to stir a flicker of hope in his chest. The figure hissed again, a sound like nails on a chalkboard, and Michael felt a sudden surge of adrenaline. His legs, numb with terror just moments ago, began to move. It wasn't much, but it was enough to push him toward the light. The house shook violently, as though it was fighting to hold him back. The walls groaned, cracking, splintering as though it were alive, desperate to drag him back into its suffocating embrace. But the light was growing, cutting through the darkness like a blade. For a moment, Michael dared to believe he could escape. But as his hand reached toward the light, the world around him shattered. Everything went black. The blackness was like a void, an infinite expanse that stretched on forever. No walls, no floor, no sense of direction. Just emptiness. For a moment, Michael didn't even know if he was still alive or if he had already crossed into whatever lay beyond death. His breath came in sharp, panicked gasps, and his chest ached from the absence of the pressure he had felt moments ago. Was the house still with him? The figure? He couldn't tell. There was nothing here but silence, and yet the silence felt as though it were alive, listening, watching. Then a sound. A faint hum, like a distant melody playing out of tune, echoed in the void. It was coming from somewhere, though Michael couldn't say where. It was just there, a subtle vibration that seemed to vibrate in his bones, in his very soul. And then he saw it. A single, small light flickered in the distance. It was nothing compared to the blinding glow he had seen before, but it was something. A point of clarity in a world that had been nothing but dark. Michael couldn't help himself. He moved toward it, his feet seemingly finding the ground even though it hadn't been there a moment ago. The light grew larger, its outline taking shape, but something wasn't right. The closer he got, the more distorted the light seemed to become. It warped and flickered like a faulty bulb. The edges blurred and twisted, and Michael's heart began to pound again. Was this the same light from before? Or was this something else, something far more sinister? Suddenly, the void around him shifted. The walls began to appear again, but they weren't the walls of the house. They were something worse, something alien, something wrong. They were jagged, like the edges of a broken mirror, distorting his reflection as they warped and cracked. The light pulsed once, twice, and then he heard the sound again, the humming that had drawn him in. But this time, it wasn't just a hum. It was a voice, a whisper, low and guttural, seeping into his ears like a poison. Not yet. Michael stopped. His legs froze. His mind screamed, trying to make sense of what was happening, but all he could hear was that whisper, winding around his thoughts, squeezing them tight. Not yet, it repeated, the voice more insistent now. Then the light shattered, splintering like glass. The pieces fell away, one by one, disintegrating into the air like smoke, leaving Michael in a darkness far colder than before. The walls closed in around him, not from every direction, but in patches, like some sort of uneven dreamscape coming into focus. And then he heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, the sound of something heavy and persistent dragging itself toward him. He couldn't see what it was. His eyes were too frantic, too desperate to focus, but he could feel its presence. A weight in the air that pressed down on his chest, suffocating him. Michael's breath quickened as the footsteps grew louder, closer, the rhythmic sound reverberating in his skull. He tried to move again, but his body felt paralyzed, as though the very air around him was holding him in place, trapping him in an invisible cage. "Please," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Please, no more." But the footsteps didn't stop. They didn't even falter. There was a sickening familiarity to them, something that made Michael's stomach churn. And then it spoke. Not in words, but in a language older than any he knew. It was a sound that didn't make sense, yet somehow, in the deepest parts of his mind, it did. He understood it. He felt it. The walls trembled, and the air grew colder still. Michael's heart raced, his breath shallow as he struggled to make sense of the impossible. Suddenly, a deep, rumbling growl filled the space around him. It was like a vibration through the floor, crawling through his bones. The walls shifted again, this time growing jagged, the air thickening with something vile and suffocating. Michael couldn't tell if he was still dreaming or if he was awake. Nothing made sense. The footsteps kept coming, the low, guttural growl growing louder with each passing moment. It was coming for him. He didn't know what it was, didn't know what was going to happen next. But he knew with an undeniable certainty that it was too late to turn back. "Not yet," the voice whispered again, like a cruel promise. Then the world broke apart.
Welcome to Horror Stories for Sleep Volume 7. Volume 7 already, and I'm getting all kinds of support. Thank you people for subscribing. Let's begin. The rain began to fall in relentless sheets, drumming against the windshield of the old, battered station wagon. The headlights barely pierced through the oppressive darkness that swallowed the winding back road, casting weak, jittering beams onto the slick asphalt. Maddie gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles bone white, as she glanced at the rearview mirror. Nothing, just the yawning black of the road behind her. Her heart thudded in her chest, though she couldn't explain why. The air inside the car felt suffocating, heavy with something unspoken. She turned up the heater, trying to banish the chill that had crept into her bones, though she wasn't entirely sure it was the cold causing it. She was lost. The map app on her phone had frozen nearly an hour ago, leaving her to rely on faded road signs and gut instinct. Her destination, a remote cabin promised by a coworker as the perfect escape, felt like a cruel joke now. The directions had seemed straightforward until the rainstorm hit, turning familiar landmarks into obscured blurs and the road into a treacherous maze. As she rounded another sharp curve, the headlights illuminated a sign, a gas station barely visible through the deluge. Relief washed over her. The station was decrepit, its paint peeling and its lone pump looking as though it hadn't dispensed fuel in decades. Still, the flickering neon open sign in the window was enough to make her pull over. The moment she stepped out of the car, the rain hit her like ice needles. She ran to the station's entrance, pushing open the glass door. A bell jangled overhead, announcing her arrival. Inside, the air smelled of mildew and oil. Rows of dusty shelves lined the small space, filled with canned goods and faded snacks that looked as old as the building. Behind the counter sat a man, his face obscured by the brim of a tattered hat. He didn't look up as she entered, his gnarled fingers busy with something beneath the counter. "Hi," Maddie said, her voice shaking slightly. My phone's dead, and I think I'm lost. Do you have a charger? Or maybe some directions? The man's hand paused, mid-motion. Slowly, he raised his head, his face emerging from the shadow of the hat. His eyes were pale and glassy, the irises nearly blending with the whites. When he spoke, his voice was gravelly, like stones scraping against metal. You shouldn't be out here. Maddie frowned. I know, the storm's awful, but... No, he interrupted, his voice sharper now. I mean, you shouldn't be here. A chill ran down her spine, colder than the rain. What do you mean? The man leaned back, exposing the rest of his face. Deep scars carved into his cheeks created a grotesque, jagged smile. He gestured lazily to the window. You'll want to get moving before it catches you. Maddie's breath hitched. Before what catches me? The man didn't answer. He simply stood, revealing a hunched figure clad in greasy overalls. Without another word, he shuffled to the back room, the door creaking shut behind him. Maddie stood frozen for a moment, the uneasy silence pressing against her. Suddenly, the bell above the entrance jangled again. She whipped around, expecting to see another traveler seeking refuge from the storm. Instead, the door hung slightly ajar, swinging on its rusted hinges. Beyond it, the rain poured harder, the world outside a smear of gray and black. Hello, she called out, her voice small in the cavernous quiet. No response. The lights flickered, casting eerie shadows across the shelves. Maddie swallowed hard, stepping closer to the counter. She noticed, for the first time, a small notebook lying open on its surface. The pages were warped with water stains, the ink smeared, but a few words stood out clearly. Do not look outside. Her pulse quickened as the wind howled, rattling the windows. Maddie took a shaky step backward, her gaze darting to the window despite herself. For a moment, all she saw was the rain. But then, something moved. It wasn't a person, nor an animal. It was too fast, too fluid. A shadow rippled across the glass, disappearing into the storm before she could fully register its form. Her breath came in short gasps now. She clutched the edge of the counter, her fingers digging into the worn wood. This isn't real, she whispered to herself. It's just the storm. But then the back room door creaked open. The man emerged, but something was wrong. His movements were jerky, unnatural, as though his joints were bending in ways they shouldn't. His head tilted to one side, a guttural sound escaping his lips, a wet, gurgling noise that made Maddie's stomach turn. He stepped closer, and she stumbled back, her heel catching on a loose tile. She hit the ground hard, the air rushing from her lungs. As she scrambled to her feet, her eyes darted to the window again. This time, the shadow didn't disappear. It loomed, its outline sharper now, a grotesque, towering shape that seemed to pulse with the rhythm of the rain. And then, slowly, it turned toward her. Maddie's heart pounded in her chest as she scrambled to her feet, her hands slick with sweat and the remnants of rain. Her gaze was locked on the window, where the shape outside had grown clearer, more defined. It was tall, impossibly tall, with limbs that stretched in unnatural angles, as though they had been twisted and bent in ways that defied the laws of anatomy. The silhouette flickered, its movements jerky, as though it was still adjusting to the space it now occupied. Behind her, the man let out another gurgling moan, stepping closer, each step dragging like a heavy weight. His pale eyes were fixed on her with a predatory intensity, a faint but unmistakable hunger lurking in their depths. He reached for her, his fingers stiff and twitching, before suddenly halting. His head jerked to the side, his body freezing in place. Outside, the shadow moved again, but this time, it didn't vanish into the storm. It stepped closer to the window, its presence growing more oppressive, as though it were pressing against the very glass, demanding to be seen. Maddie's breath hitched. The shape seemed to grow larger with every passing second, its distorted form bending and twisting as if it were no longer constrained by the natural order of things. A sudden thought gripped her, a realization that tightened her throat and twisted her stomach in knots. It wasn't the man behind her that was dangerous. It was what had been lurking outside. Her pulse thundered in her ears. She tore her eyes away from the window and darted toward the door, her hands fumbling for the handle. It was stuck, locked, just as she had seen earlier. Panic rose within her chest, her breaths coming in ragged gasps as she tugged at the door in vain. Behind her, the man began to chuckle, a low, raspy sound that grated against her nerves, reverberating through the stale air of the station. His laugh seemed to be growing, multiplying, echoing around her like a chorus of tortured souls. The walls of the small station trembled, as though the laughter was shaking them from the inside out. Maddie's eyes darted to the back room. The man's body was now swaying unnaturally, the jerky movements becoming more pronounced. His fingers twitched uncontrollably, stretching and twisting into grotesque shapes, as if they were too long for his hands. His mouth opened wide, too wide, revealing rows of sharp, uneven teeth. The grotesque smile he wore earlier had stretched to an impossible width, as though it was being forced open by some unseen force. And then a noise, a loud crash from the window. The shadow outside had slammed against the glass, its massive form pressing up against the station like a wave about to break. The impact made the entire building shudder. Maddie turned just in time to see the man lurch toward her, his movements suddenly swift, predatory. But the moment he reached for her, he stopped, his eyes locked onto something behind her, his expression shifting to one of intense, almost frantic fear. Before she could turn to see what he was looking at, the door to the back room burst open with an ear-splitting screech. From the doorway, an unnatural figure emerged, far worse than anything Maddie could have imagined. Its body was contorted, its limbs elongated in ways that made the man's movements look almost graceful in comparison. Its face was a hollow void, a black pit of nothingness, but a terrible presence radiated from it, a weight that pressed down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. Maddie could feel her pulse racing, her body trembling uncontrollably as the air grew thick with the sound of something skittering just beyond the edges of her perception. She had no choice but to back away, her hands searching wildly for anything she could use to defend herself. But the room was barren, save for the shelves of decaying goods. The thing in front of her moved again, its grotesque body scraping against the walls, its limbs twitching and jerking like something out of a nightmare. It seemed to be drawn to the man, or perhaps the other way around. The two locked eyes, and in that instant, the air shifted. The man's fear had turned to something else, something darker. The thing's hollow form seemed to swell, as though the very air around it was being consumed by its presence. It advanced toward the man with a slow, deliberate pace. He recoiled, but there was no escape. It was clear now he wasn't just afraid of what was outside. He had been waiting for it. The man's lips curled into a smile again, but this time it was different. It wasn't a mocking grin. It was one of understanding, of shared knowledge that Maddie couldn't begin to comprehend. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words never came. The thing reached out, grabbing him with unnatural speed, its hands folding around his head like a vice. The man let out a strangled scream, but it was cut off as the creature pulled him into the darkness. Maddie's heart leapt into her throat as she spun toward the door, realizing that the only way out was through whatever that thing was. She ran, every muscle in her body screaming for her to get away, to escape from the nightmare that had been closing in on her since she arrived. But as she reached for the door once more, the air grew colder, thicker, and then she heard it, a whisper, "Stay." The door slammed shut before she could touch it, and she was plunged into darkness. The darkness felt alive, suffocating, as if it had weight. Maddie's breath quickened, panic clawing at her chest. Her eyes strained, desperately searching for something, anything, that could offer her a clue, a way out. But there was nothing. No light, no sign of the twisted figure that had just consumed the man. Only the sound of her own heartbeat, pounding so loudly in her ears that it drowned out everything else. A shiver crawled up her spine. The air around her grew colder still, as if the walls themselves were exhaling some unseen chill. Her hands, trembling uncontrollably, reached out in front of her, fingers brushing against the rough surface of the door. The texture felt wrong, slick, sticky, like something had been smeared across it. Then the whisper came again. "Stay." Her body froze. The voice wasn't coming from any direction. It was everywhere, inside her skull, in the very marrow of her bones. It was inescapable, impossible to ignore. Felt familiar in a way she couldn't comprehend. She hadn't heard it before, but it felt like something she had known forever, something that had always been a part of her. Maddie gritted her teeth and slammed her palm against the door, as if by sheer force she could break through the paralysis it had caused. She had to get out, had to find a way to escape before whatever had taken the man could claim her too. But the door didn't budge. A low, guttural noise filled the space, like the creaking of old bones or the groan of something enormous shifting in the dark. Her pulse spiked, her throat tight as the oppressive darkness pressed in from every corner of the room. She spun around, every muscle in her body tense, waiting for the presence to make itself known. The shadows shifted. The air thickened, grew heavy, as though something was moving beneath the surface, creeping through the unseen cracks. Then she felt it, something touching her. Not physically, but in a way that defied all logic. It was like the air around her had solidified into something tangible. "I've been waiting," the voice murmured again, far too close. It was in her head, yet not. There was no sense of it coming from a particular direction. It was everywhere, inescapable. She could feel it, the weight of its gaze pressing down on her as if it were right beside her, just out of sight. The sound of movement came from behind her, a slow, deliberate drag of something long and thin scraping against the floor. The hairs on the back of her neck stood at attention, her blood turning to ice as she slowly turned to face whatever was creeping in the darkness. There was nothing at first, only the heavy silence that clung to the air, thick and oppressive. But then she saw it, a sliver of motion in the shadows, something that moved just at the edge of her vision. Her stomach lurched as her mind tried to comprehend it. It was small at first, a shadow within the shadows, shifting with a fluidity that made it seem like a part of the darkness itself. But as her eyes adjusted, she saw it more clearly. It wasn't just a shape. It was a person. No, not a person. The outline of a person, perhaps, but twisted and malformed in a way that made her stomach churn. Its limbs were too long, too thin, like they had been stretched beyond reason. Its body moved in disjointed jerks, as though it was struggling to hold itself together. Each movement was unnaturally fast, too quick to follow, too erratic. Its head swiveled at an impossible angle. Its eyes, if they could even be called eyes, glowed faintly in the dark, two pale smears in the black void where its face should have been. The creature made no sound, its movements as silent as the darkness around it. But Maddie could feel it, feel its presence inching closer, even though she couldn't see it clearly. It was everywhere and nowhere all at once. She took a hesitant step back, her breathing shallow and quick, but her feet felt like they were sinking into the floor. The air thickened again, wrapping around her like a physical force, pressing her against the door, preventing her from moving. The silence was deafening now, broken only by the faint, wet sound of something dripping, something large, something alive. The creature's head snapped to one side, its neck twisting at an impossible angle. For a brief moment, the glowing remnants of its eyes met hers. Then it smiled. The grin was stretched across its face, impossibly wide, its jagged teeth too numerous, too sharp to belong to any human being. It wasn't a smile of joy. It was the smile of something hungry, something that had been starved for far too long. And it wasn't smiling at her. It was smiling at the door behind her. Her breath caught in her throat. She knew what was on the other side. She knew what it wanted. The thing wasn't after her. Not yet. It was waiting for the door to open. Maddie's mind raced. The thing, whatever it was, wanted her to open the door. But why? What was behind it that could possibly interest something so wrong? She had no time to answer her own questions as the air grew denser, pulsating with an unseen energy that made her teeth ache. It felt like the room itself was alive, contracting and expanding in rhythm with her panicked breaths. The creature tilted its head further, the grotesque smile growing wider. Then it raised a hand, or what she assumed was a hand. The limb was skeletal, stretched unnaturally long, the fingers tapering into jagged points, pointed directly at her, then at the door. Its intentions were clear. Open it. No, Maddie muttered, her voice barely a whisper against the oppressive silence. She pressed her back against the door, her palms flat against the sticky surface as if she could physically hold it shut. I won't. The creature's smile faltered. Its head jerked forward, twitching violently as its entire body contorted into an unnatural pose, almost as if it was testing its limits. The room filled with the sound of something cracking, bones, or perhaps the very walls themselves. The creature leaned closer, its glowing eyes now mere inches from her face, though there was still an insurmountable gulf of shadow between them. You don't understand, the voice whispered. Not from the creature's non-existent mouth, but from everywhere at once. It was colder now, more insistent, laced with something that felt disturbingly like desperation. It's not for me. Maddie shook her head, her body trembling. I don't care. I'm not opening it. Her defiance seemed to amuse the creature. The grin returned, impossibly wider now, stretching across what should have been its face. It moved back into the shadows with a sickening lurch, disappearing for a moment. Maddie felt a brief, fleeting hope that it was gone. But the sound of movement behind her crushed that hope instantly. Something was on the other side of the door. The pounding started softly, a dull, rhythmic thud that grew louder with each strike. Maddie jumped away from the door, her hands trembling at her sides as the sticky residue clinging to her palms made her skin crawl. She could see the door shake with each impact, the wood splintering at the edges. Whatever was on the other side wasn't going to wait much longer. The creature reappeared, now standing fully upright, or at least as upright as its grotesque body allowed. Its limbs seemed to grow longer with every passing second, its outline becoming more indistinct, blending with the dark. It gestured to the door again, this time with both hands, as if urging her to comply. If you don't, it will. What will? Maddie shouted, her voice cracking under the weight of her fear. What's on the other side? The creature didn't answer. Instead, it began to laugh, a low, guttural sound that echoed endlessly in the enclosed space. The pounding on the door intensified, shaking the entire room. Maddie stumbled backward, her mind screaming for her to do something, anything, She looked at the door, then at the creature, her heart pounding in her chest like a drum. She could feel the thing's gaze, even without eyes. It wasn't just watching her. It was waiting for her to make a choice. And then she heard it. A voice, faint but unmistakable, coming from the other side of the door. "Maddie?" It was a man's voice, familiar, warm, desperate. Her heart clenched. "Dad," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The pounding stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. "Maddie," the voice repeated, softer now. "Please, I need your help." Her knees buckled, and she fell to the ground, her head spinning. It sounded exactly like him, but it couldn't be. He was gone. He'd been gone for years. "Don't," the creature hissed, its voice sharp and venomous. The first time it had shown anything close to emotion. "It's not him." Maddie's breathing hitched, her hands clenching into fists. "But it sounds like..." "It's not him," the creature snarled, the grin vanishing entirely. His form grew more distorted, more frantic. For the first time, Maddie saw something other than malice in its expression. Fear. The pounding resumed, harder and faster now, the wood splintering further with each blow. Maddie's mind raced. If she opened the door, she might find her father, or she might unleash whatever horror lay behind it. If she did nothing, the thing on the other side might break through anyway. Her hands hovered over the handle. Her entire body shook with indecision. "Maddie," the voice on the other side called again, softer now, tinged with sadness. "Don't you want to see me?" Tears streamed down her face as she looked back at the creature. It was still there, silent now, watching her with its glowing, empty eyes. The choice was hers. Maddie's trembling hand hovered over the doorknob, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The voice on the other side sounded so real, so heartbreakingly familiar. It has to be him. It has to. But deep down, in the marrow of her bones, she felt the wrongness of it. Every instinct screamed at her to stop. Behind her, the creature remained still, its jagged outline flickering faintly in the dim light. It had stopped trying to persuade her. It didn't need to anymore. The choice was hers, and whatever was coming would be her doing. The pounding on the door softened, replaced by a steady scraping sound. It was rhythmic, deliberate, like nails dragging against wood. Maddie cringed at the sound, her teeth grinding together. "Maddie, please," the voice came again, barely audible over the scraping. "You don't understand. I can't hold on much longer." Her heart twisted painfully. The way the voice cracked, the pleading undertone. It was everything her father would have sounded like in desperation. She wanted to believe. She needed to believe. "Maddie," it whispered again. "It's so dark in here." Tears spilled down her cheeks as she let out a broken sob. I don't know what to do," she cried, spinning to face the creature. "What's behind this door? Why is this happening?" The creature tilted its head, its jagged grin absent now. Its voice was softer this time, though still unervingly cold. "Not all things buried stay buried. You've dug too deep." "What are you talking about?" Maddie shouted, frustration mixing with her terror. The creature didn't answer. Instead, it extended one long, clawed hand and pointed toward the door again, as if to remind her of the urgency. The scraping stopped. Her breath caught in her throat as the silence pressed down on her like a physical weight. Then, a faint rattling came from the other side of the door, like chains being dragged across stone. Maddie took a step back, her hands shaking uncontrollably. "Maddie," the voice called again, but this time it wasn't just her father's voice. Others joined it, a cacophony of whispers overlapping, each voice more desperate and fragmented than the last. "Help us! Let us out!" Please." Her knees buckled, and she pressed her hands over her ears, trying to drown out the sounds. The door began to shake violently, the wood splintering as cracks spiderwebbed across its surface. The creature hissed, recoiling from the door. Its form seemed to shrink slightly, as if whatever was on the other side posed a threat even to it. "Don't open it," it snarled. "You don't want to see what waits for you." Maddie looked between the creature and the door, her mind spiraling into chaos. Every rational thought warred with her desperate longing. What if it really is him? The rattling grew louder, more frantic. The voices grew sharper, their desperation unbearable. "Maddie, please," they cried in unison, shaking the door with renewed force. Her hand shot out, gripping the knob before she could stop herself. The creature screamed, a guttural, inhuman sound that made the walls tremble. "No!" it bellowed, lunging toward her. But it was too late. The moment Maddie turned the knob, a searing heat erupted from the door, forcing her to stumble back. The wood cracked and split as an otherworldly light burst through the gaps, illuminating the room with a blinding, unnatural glow. The voices stopped. For a moment, there was only silence. Then the door swung open, revealing a yawning, endless void that pulsed with a sickly, churning light. Shapes moved within it, twisting, writhing things that defied comprehension. Maddie's breath caught as a wave of unimaginable terror crashed over her, freezing her in place. From the void, something began to emerge. The void churned violently as a form began to coalesce from its depths. It wasn't human, far from it. Its shape defied logic, constantly shifting between grotesque configurations. Sprawling appendages, impossibly large eyes, and a pulsating mass that seemed alive in its own twisted rhythm. Maddie staggered back, her breath hitching as a wave of nausea and terror threatened to consume her. The creature's presence was overwhelming, its sheer size and power pressing against her mind, as though it could crush her with thought alone. The voices that had begged her for salvation were gone, replaced by a low, guttural hum that resonated deep within her chest. The door frame splintered and cracked as the entity fully emerged, its bulk folding and unfolding into impossible shapes. Maddie tried to scream, but no sound escaped her lips. The creature didn't lunge or attack. Instead, it watched, not with eyes, but with an all-encompassing awareness that stripped away any illusion of safety she had clung to. The jagged creature that had been taunting her recoiled, its form shrinking to a shadowed wisp. "You've doomed us all," it whispered, its voice trembling for the first time. Maddie's knees buckled as the entity shifted closer, the void behind it expanding and consuming the walls of the room. Reality itself seemed to warp and twist in its presence. She felt her body unraveling, not physically, but in some deeper, more terrifying way. "Why?" she managed to choke out, her voice barely audible. "Why me?" The creature didn't answer, but she felt its response, an overwhelming sense of inevitability. It wasn't malice or rage that drove it. It was hunger. Maddie's choice had only opened the door to what was always waiting. The void surged forward, swallowing the floor beneath her feet. She fell, spiraling into the endless, twisting nothingness. Time stretched and fractured. Moments felt like years, and years felt like moments. Maddie's memories splintered apart, each fragment devoured by the churning void. And yet, she was aware, painfully aware, as her identity unraveled. She became one of the countless voices she had heard before, trapped in the void, endlessly calling out for help to anyone who might dare to listen. The door slammed shut with a deafening finality. In the small, empty room, silence returned. The jagged creature reappeared, alone once more. It slithered toward the closed door, its form flickering as it muttered to itself. "Another fool," it hissed, voice dripping with disdain. "Always another." But as it retreated into the shadows, the faintest crack reappeared in the door's surface. And somewhere, far away, another soul began to hear the whispers.